Good evening all and welcome, and thank you all so much for being here. It means a lot that you choose to watch this channel. I have a chilling collection of scary stories in the rain for you to enjoy, but for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. When I was younger, I had a terrifying experience while camping near a riverbed. Our campsite was located a few hundred feet away from the river, and my family's tent was just a few yards to our left. Little did we know that a dreadful surprise awaited us when we woke up. As we emerged from our slumber, we realized with a sinking feeling in the pit of our stomach that our tent was filling with water. It's hard to describe the overwhelming sense of dread that washed over us. With a mix of panic and urgency, I quickly unzipped the tent, only to find ourselves standing in about 4 inches of water. The situation escalated rapidly as our tent, seemingly possessed by the rushing river, was torn from its mooring and floated away into the darkness of the night. We called out desperately for our parents, who sprang into action and emerged from their own tent, which was also being carried away by the powerful current. My mother's cries of our names mingled with the chaos as my father initially prepared to swim for our disappearing tent, only to realize that we were all out safely. Without missing a beat, we sprinted through the campground, our hearts pounding in our chest. With each step we took, the water level seemed to rise, the ground beneath our feet disappearing beneath the restless torrent. By the time we reached higher ground, the river had surged to our knees, and the surrounding scene was one of devastation. Trees were being uprooted and swept away by the roaring river, while the playground and picnic tables had been destroyed, carried off by the unforgiving current. The only remnants left standing were the grills firmly anchored to the ground. Tragically, there were casualties from the flash flood, although not at the campground we were at. Some individuals had parked their trailers next to the riverbank, and a few were tragically swept away. The danger was immense. Once the water rose, even a 3-foot-high trailer would be carried a quarter of a mile downstream before its occupants had a chance to react. The morning after the ordeal, the campground lay in ruins, bearing witness to the destructive power of nature's fury. It was a sobering reminder of how swiftly and mercilessly our surroundings can change. Let me start off by saying that this is a true story that happened to me when I was around 13. I'm 27 now. Whether you believe me or not is up to you. My dad used to be part of a small hunting club in Alabama, just a handful of guys he grew up with there. Once a year, we would drive down to the small town of Elba to camp for a few days and go hunting. There were a few different areas of land around the town that the club owned, and club members could go hunting there. One of these pieces of land was nicknamed the cemetery, because it had an old cemetery on it. Nothing really creepy about the cemetery per se. It was in the woods, and the graves were of slave owners and the graves of slaves. Now in the area, the land nicknamed the cemetery, there are 5 or 6 green fields, a cleared out area where there are no trees, just grass and a buck hunt to hunt in. A buck hunt is a treehouse you sit in to wait for deer to walk out onto the green field. This particular evening, we were going to hunt on Greenfield 1, the plot directly behind the old cemetery. The evening started off normally enough. My dad parked the truck and we walked down the trail to the buck hunt. We climbed up and started to wait and watch in the woods. A little bit of a pastime of my dad's was to tell me that he was going to go for a short walk to see if he could maybe see any deer on the trail. Keep in mind I'm about 13, not a big deal, I've hunted by myself before, and I'm not afraid of being alone in the woods. Besides, it was still pretty light out. Okay. He climbed down and it was just me, my .32 caliber Marlin rifle, the grass field in front of me, and the dense woods around me. This is where things start to get strange. I sat there for an eternity, or what felt like an eternity, and it was now almost twilight. My concern for my dad had grown, because he was still not back. I was worried that maybe something had happened to him, or maybe he got lost. However, he's an experienced hunter, and if he was lost he would yell or fire off a shot, but the woods had been dead silent. I figured maybe he found a good spot that he wanted to hunt in the twilight/dusk hours for the day, because that's prime time for hunting. So I focused my attention on the grass field in front of me, just watching, listening, and waiting for a deer to walk out on the field as the light of day began to fade. Just then, across the field, I saw and heard some brush moving and breaking. The thought did cross my mind that it could be my dad, but I highly doubted it. No way it would be him. That would be incredibly dangerous and stupid. I raised my rifle, pulled back the hammer, and aimed it at the moving brush, patiently waiting for what I hoped would be a deer. Just then, a girl floated out of the woods and onto the grassy field. She was transparent, with a long, flowing dress and long white hair. She floated from one side of the field to the other and disappeared back into the woods. I watched her for a solid minute or two and couldn't believe my eyes. I was petrified. A short time passed and now it's pitch black and I'm still alone. My concern for my dad was turning into panic, but I was too afraid to yell or to look for him in the pitch dark woods where I just saw a ghost. I sat there for hours, terrified and alone in the darkness. Thankfully, he finally returned, and he acted as if he hadn't been gone that long at all. I asked him where the hell he went, and he said he just went for a short walk up the trail, turned around and came back. The timeline made no sense. He was gone for hours. It was unlike him to leave me alone for that long. He was adamant he had only been gone a little while, maybe 15 to 30 minutes. We walked down the trail back to his truck, and I couldn't get out of there fast enough. The whole experience still confuses me to this day. Was the ghost I saw an old slave or slave owner buried in the woods behind me? Or something else entirely? Did my dad go through some time walk where time sped up? I don't know. I never went hunting there again, and don't plan on ever returning either. I worked for years as an anti-poaching ranger / ecologist and field guide throughout Africa. From guiding in Kruger National Park to tranquilizing elephants near Mount Kilimanjaro and leading anti-poaching patrols in the Okavango Delta of Angola. I've seen and done a lot. I've seen infinite amounts of beauty and good, but also my fair share of civil unrest and war, murders, firefights and animal attacks, wildfires and more. Despite all the things I have experienced, one of the creatures that unsettled me the most during my time in the bush was the leopard. The following is why. Near the beginning of my career, I worked in a large national park in the KwaZulu-Natal province of South Africa. The foothills of the Drakensberg Mountains began here and climbed until you reached the border of Lesotho to the west. The park teemed with wildlife, elephants, rhino, African painted wolves and more. But in the shadows and canopies of the foothill, crevasses of the cliffs, and wet areas of the lowlands, the elusive leopard prowled. Stories about these big cats were pounded into our heads in training by the older guides. Never make eye contact with one, or you'll be dead before you know what you saw. Oi, you're right screwed if you get on them. They dig their claws into your stomach and rip your guts out. That is, if they don't come up behind you and get you by the neck. So needless to say, those of us working in the remote bush always kept our eyes peeled, ears focused and rifles loaded. I remember few things more terrifying than walking through dense forest at night, waiting to catch two eyes in your flashlight shine, staring down at you. I never did end up on the business side of a leopard, but I searched for those who did. The area's biggest industry was tourism. Every year, thousands, likely hundreds of thousands or more, streamed into the parks hoping to capture photos, memories and knickknacks. As a result, many local and foreign people became guides, hoping to find their fortune guiding these high-paying folks on expensive trips. One of these men was an Afrikaner by the name of Axel. He was a goofy but friendly enough fellow who would cruise around in his 1980s Toyota Land Cruiser, packed with tourists. However, he was notorious for breaking the rules. He would drive off trail, get closer to the animals than what was permitted, and have a terrible addiction to tobacco, which pushed him up to the light, even during dry season, when the entire park was a tinderbox. Given my position as a ranger and ecologist at the time, I had many different interactions with Axel, mostly revolving around his misconduct. Despite this, I liked the guy, his personality was great, and you could always rely on him for a cigarette and a light from his black Zippo lighter. During wet season, of course. During the wet season, a deep and narrow creek cascades down from the foothills and flows into the park's largest wetland area. About a mile from the wetland, a large concrete and iron bridge offered transport over the river's raging waters. It was dry season when Alex parked his tourist-filled Land Cruiser on the bridge, so the creek bed was cracked and bone dry. He let his passengers out, as the view from the bridge to the wetland was phenomenal. He told them to stay put, as he went to take a leak. He walked to the far side of the bridge and disappeared, under the spot where the bridge connected to the top of the berm that slowly sloped 30 feet down to the bottom of the creek bed. The tourists watched him go, then resumed snapping pictures towards the wetland. Suddenly the call of a grey lory echoed out. The grey lory is more commonly known as the grey go-away bird, as it sounds like someone yelling, "Go away!" Whenever us rangers heard the call, we would instantly be on high alert, as we knew the lory had sensed a predator afoot. Immediately after the lory's call, the sound of thrashing bush and a muffled scream echoed from the creek. Several tourists darted over to the side of the bridge in time to see a massive leopard bound out from under the bridge, dragging Axel's body by the neck. The grey lory continued to cry "Go away," as the leopard and Axel vanished into the dense bush. We arrived an hour after the tourists called for help and took the eyewitness accounts. We then parked our rucks and loaded our rifles to track down the leopard and the guide's body. The first thing we found was a pack of cigarettes and the black Zippo lighter scattered on the ground just under the bridge. He hadn't gone under to urinate, but rather to light up out of sight, as the act was illegal at this time of year. His last act of rule breaking killed him. We followed the blood down the creek bed to where we found a dirty boonie cap. 100 meters away we found a shoe. Soon enough, the blood trail vanished, as did the leopard's tracks. The search lasted almost 2 weeks before it was scaled back, and then shut down. Axel was never found. Almost exactly 1 year after Axel met his fate, I was working on a large reserve in Botswana. The park's biodiversity attracted a great number of visitors every year, many of whom spent the night in luxury lodges and resorts tucked away in the park's borders. Those of us who spend our nights in tents, waiting in ambush for poachers, or monitoring the movements of nocturnal species with infrared binoculars, understood the extreme danger that the African bush conceals. Many of the visitors did not. I had just used Axel's Zippo to light a braai when the radio crackled to life, telling our team to report for a search and rescue to a nearby luxury lodge. We begrudgingly packed away the meat and veggies we'd intended to cook and drove the 20 minutes to the lodge. Outside the lodge, a father and mother cried, attempting to console each other in between gut-wrenching sobs. 2 children sat next to each other on the lodge's steps, staring off into the night like they had just come back from the front lines. The other guests were gathered on the steps of their own little yurts, talking lowly amongst each other. As we dismounted the pickup, the night guard walked over to us, his face tight and grim. Leopard got their daughter, he stated in a thick Zulu accent. We told them not to sleep on the balcony. We climbed to the balcony and found a tattered hammock with a massive trail of blood leading off the edge and into the trees. A teenage tourist on vacation from Europe with her family had slept on the open-air balcony of their lodge they'd rented. At night, As the night guard had warned them, a leopard slipped into their camp, climbed a nearby tree onto the lodge's roof, and snatched the young girl in her sleep. Unlike Axel, we found her several hours later, stuffed into a large hole about 7 feet up in a tree. That night we shot the leopard dead, as is standard procedure when such an animal begins preying on humans. I have witnessed paranormal events, Mortis magic, ethnic cleansing, hippo attacks, but nothing disturbed me more than getting snatched up by a predator, never to be seen or heard from again. To this day, when I'm hiking in the woods of the United States, going for a late-night run, or taking my dog out to the bathroom, I keep my eyes and lights on the bush, and a hand on my loaded pistol.
Back in 2015, when I was 12, I went on my Year 6 reward camp. It was a place called Woodman's Point. The place is isolated in the midst of suburbia, but its surrounding bushland made it feel remote. In 1886, it was a quarantine station isolating immigrants with smallpox, the bubonic plague, and even the Spanish flu, which means that at least a few people have died there. The facility continued being used as such until '79 when it was closed. Fast forward to modern day, there is now a recreational camp that hosts many school and outdoor activities including rock climbing with an area called the Cube, with a flying fox on it. The camp had dormitories that we were split up into genders, and luckily I was placed with my friends. The camp itself was fun, and we played games with the counselors and in the bush surrounding it, built rafts on the beach and tried out the Cube in all of its glory. One night before dinner, our teachers organized a group activity where each dormitory had to find glow sticks, with the dormitory who finds the most glow sticks winning. This is where the scary begins. The group was made up of 7 or 8 students, and we were arranged with 2 looking in the front, 2 looking behind us, and the rest of us looking to the sides. That was where I was arranged. Sounds like a smart game plan, but you'd be wrong, as our group found not a single glow stick. We were walking down a path with 2 buildings on either side, when the front 2 saw what they describe as a pale, skinny, naked old guy running between the buildings. No one else saw it, and we began talking and teasing the hell out of who saw it. When we were about to round the corner, the thing peeped around and looked at us. The exchange only lasted seconds, but in that time I noticed how frail it was, how it was really pale with a small mouth. I don't remember seeing eyes, just sockets. That's what I saw. Every one of us saw the same thing, and we quickly turned and ran for our teachers in fear, crying. Of course, the teachers didn't believe us, said it just being the torchlight. There was another school doing their camp, and they could have been doing activities too, but we didn't hear or see anyone. Sometimes I come across my old friends, and we still talk about it, and it was still the scariest thing we've ever seen.
I was out for a walk early one morning in a forest preserve that's usually pretty empty. I started coming around a corner, and I can see a car that's parked on the grass just outside of a parking lot. I think it's strange, but keep on walking. I'm probably about 50 feet from the car now, and suddenly the trunk pops open, the car alarm starts going off, and the driver's side door opens. I'm coming from the passenger side and can't see the driver, but I get a bad feeling about the situation. I keep walking on the path and come around where I can see the driver's side of the car. A guy is sitting in the driver's car seat and starts to wave me over to him. He throws his hands up and says, "I'm not sure what's going on, but can you help me?" I tell him, nah, he's on his own, without breaking my stride, and keep moving. He throws up his hands again, turns off the car alarm, gets out, shuts the trunk, gets in and drives away. I'm creeped out, so once he's out of sight, I double back and walk the opposite way just to be safe. I walk back about half hour to get to the lot where I parked my car. When I'm getting close, I hear the car alarm go off again. It freaked me out now, but I didn't want to walk back to the woods again, so I keep going to the parking lot. When I get there, that same car is parked with its trunk open, car alarm going off and driver's door open. The guy is already talking to someone else in the parking lot. He sees me come into the lot, looks at me for about a minute, shuts off the car alarm, closes the trunk and drives away. I just booked it to my car and called the park rangers, but they didn't believe anything was weird about it, and I'm 90% sure that dude was trying to kidnap someone. 2 years ago, I embarked on a visit to visit family in northern Minnesota during Labor Day weekend. My girlfriend and I were eagerly anticipating a serenic camping trip with her family, hoping for a break from the hustle and bustle of city life. Arriving at our destination around noon on Saturday, we were warmly greeted by everyone. As the day transitioned into evening, we immersed ourselves in various enjoyable activities, catching up with each other's lives. The hours passed by until we found ourselves huddled around the campfire until 11 p.m. Eventually, both of our families retired for the night and made their way to their respective sleeping quarters. Mary, one of my girlfriend's relatives, kindly offered us a spacious 6-person tent earlier in the day, since we only brought a smaller 2-person tent. It was a thoughtful gesture, and we appreciated the extra room for our belongings and air mattress. Mary's tent was positioned not too far from the campfire, nestled among the trees. The family had done an excellent job of the clearing and maintaining the area, accommodating their smaller RVs and traditional tents. The 3 of us lay there chatting until we eventually drifted off to sleep. However, sleep eluded me, and I resorted to passing the time on my phone, hoping exhaustion would eventually take over. That's when I noticed faint activity in the woods about 40 yards away. I dismissed it, attributing the sound to deer, as they are known for frequenting the area. Engrossed in my phone, I continued to distract myself, perusing random things online. However, after 10 or 20 minutes, the noise grew closer, piquing my curiosity. The snapping of twigs and rustling amongst the bushes became more distinct, gradually advancing towards our tent and the clearing. At this point, I could feel a subtle tremor in the ground, as if something sizable were traversing the area. Moments later, the enigmatic presence was merely 10 yards away from our tent, pacing back and forth with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine, each step reverberating through the earth akin to the thumping of a drum at a rock concert. Fear began to consume me as I strained to trace the footsteps that darted around the rear side of our tent. Then, the entity came within 5 yards of our tent before stopping abruptly near Mary's side. An indescribable dread overwhelmed me as I braced for what might happen next. Suddenly, Mary jolted upright from a deep slumber, gasping for air and calling out our names in a voice riddled with terror. The entity retreated into the woods, leaving both of us startled and shaken. The forest fell eerily silent after gathering our courage, and we cautiously peered outside the tent. There was no sight or sound to be found, and 30 minutes later we bolted to their shop to retrieve a shotgun. After this, we remained on high alert. Mary recounted that during the time I was awake, she had experienced a dream. She claimed that malevolent entities were tormenting her relentlessly, demanding her soul or seeking to end her life. My girlfriend dismissed it as a mere product of her imagination, suggesting it was probably just a deer or some other harmless creature romping around. Faced with my girlfriend's rationalization, I chose to keep this eerie incident to myself, refraining from sharing it with anyone until now. As I contemplate the events more, I couldn't help but wonder about the true nature of the enigmatic entity that disturbed our peaceful camping trip. My cousin is with the Forest Service in the Montana/Wyoming area, and I decided to go up there with her to literally test the waters. She does hydrology and has to ride out to the middle of nowhere to test streams and snow runoffs to ensure no contaminants. So I thought that sounded fun and wanted to do a bit of a tour with her. We were going to camp out there for 2 nights, so we packed all our gear into saddlebags and saddle-buddied and started out. The first day and night were amazing. Beautiful scenery and amazing air quality. It really is so peaceful out there. I love the area and wish I could go there more often. We started out on the second day and my cousin said, "You want to see something weird?" "Of course," I said. So she led me on a bit of a side journey into this tiny little ravine. We ended up traveling about 2 hours away from our actual path we'd laid out. At the very end of this fold in the land, she dismounts and tells me to get off my horse too. We tie them up in this gorgeous little clearing, and she tells me to follow this tiny wildlife path and bring our little rechargeable radio. It is one of those things that you plug in or wind up, and also acts as a lantern if you really need it to, but that kills the battery very quickly. I do, and out in the middle of nowhere, there's a huge coil of wire sticking out of the ground. The wire itself was not weirdly large, like some buried transmission wire, but small, like 10 or 12 gauge wiring for a house. It trailed off into the brush and trees, so naturally I decided to follow the damn thing out of curiosity. My cousin trails behind me as I do, and this wire, after coming straight up off the ground, is strung across limbs of trees and then back to the ground. Then it snakes around rocks and finally deadens into an outlet. The outlet is mounted on the side of a desk. It looks like a school teacher's desk from when I was growing up, with a metal base and a pseudo wooden plastic top thing. No chair, no building, no anything. Just this outlet and this desk. I'm starting to get confused as hell as to why this desk is in the middle of a forest, when my cousin takes the radio, pulls out the cord and plugs it into the outlet. Then it started lighting up and blaring static. The wire was being fed from somewhere. Now the place where we were at had no road access, no buildings for many miles, and no other people around. And yet, there was a live outlet. Weird as hell. No spooky jump scares or bodies, just one lone, powered desk in the middle of the woods. I wish I had snapped a picture. This happened a few months ago and has been bugging me. I was out hiking and rappelling with a friend in the hills near Tombstone. I want to mention that I have spent quite a bit of time solo hiking and camping, and I'm used to hearing noises and just brushing it off. It's late afternoon. I'm the first one to rappel down. I got to the bottom, and while my partner was getting ready to follow, we heard this noise that I would describe like a growl or snarl. It sounded like it was coming from the ridge above both of us. If facing the cliff, it sounded like it was coming from the right side. We both looked around but didn't see anything. I encouraged him to come down and even half joked that it probably was just a bear or a mountain lion. At that point, I wasn't even feeling that nervous. I figured that once the two of us were together again, we would be pretty intimidating to any animal. While he rappelled down, I heard a loud crash to what seemed to be parallel to me on my left. By this point, I'm starting to get pretty scared, because it was getting closer, and also had somehow gone from right to left on an exposed cliff face without either of us seeing it. He successfully rappelled down, and we both agreed now was the time to get the hell out of there, and we still had a steep downhill climb to the car. We packed up the gear as fast as possible. As we get our backpacks on, we heard what sounded like a howler monkey. The noise was close, but we still were unable to see what exactly it was that was making it. Of course, it was from the direction that we needed to go, and we hauled ass down the mountain and got to the car. I know that it can be easy to let the mind play tricks on you, but we both heard the exact same thing. Now this is the part I get hesitant while talking about because it sounds even more insane, but we both heard whispering and giggling as if it was right next to us. I keep trying to explain to myself that our minds just played a trick. The first noise I could chalk up to a bear or mountain lion. Animals are stealthy and could run in front of us without us noticing. Something else could have fallen from the right side. What made the monkey noise though? And why do we both feel like we heard whispering? Anyone else have any creepy experiences in Arizona? I want to believe someone was pranking us, but there weren't any other cars in the parking area. My friend believes that we experienced something supernatural. I personally have no idea what to think.
I have lived in a town on the East Coast my whole life. It was a small town and so everyone knew each other. My school holds around 400 students, so it's pretty small. We don't regularly get new students, but this day in sophomore year we got 2, both girls, and they were both sophomores, same as I at the time. I became friends with one of them called Casey. About a year goes by and we're juniors now in our first semester. It was announced there was a car wash in the neighborhood next to the city I lived in. The other transfer student I was not friends with was the victim. It was announced there was a car crash in the neighborhood next to the city I lived in, and the other transfer student that I hadn't been friends with was the victim. It was announced later that day that she died from her injuries. I wasn't very good friends with her, so it didn't affect me too much. At least, not more than a low mood and condolences. What surprised me was that no one else was upset. Not a single one of her friends, no teachers nor parents. This is where the unexplainable part comes in. I went to my guidance counselor to talk about what happened because the fact that seemingly no one cared bothered me. I asked him how he felt about the incident, and he said he hadn't seen or heard the news, but was sorry I lost a friend. I told him we weren't close, but asked if he could look up her name for me, and he told me the girl I was asking for didn't exist in the school records, but found a student who shared her last name. The student? Casey. But Casey had walked into class the very next day like it was nothing. I still never understood what happened to the other transfer student because there was no record of her whenever I searched. It's still the weirdest thing to happen to me. I went to boarding school where we weren't allowed to smoke. To make up for this, I would go out at night when it was dark and smoke there. One night, I stood behind the barracks and smoked in the distance, when I see a girl figure in a long white dress and thought, who the hell is that? I mean, we couldn't exactly call for the figure because I and the rest of the lads were hiding. If the teacher came by, we would get expelled, or at the very least be sent home for a while, which obviously isn't in anyone's best interest. But it disappeared when it got further into the woods. Me and the lads were confused. I didn't think much of it as someone else probably going for a smoke, but to this day I still think about it, because it was like taken out of a movie. Weird as hell. And I still wonder, who would go out in the dark with a long white dress in the woods at night? Now I don't believe in ghosts, but if I get paranoid enough, then I do. And it's one of those times that I believe it was something not human. It still creeps me out when I think about it too much. It makes no sense to me. She just walked into the woods. And I know that isn't the best way to describe it, but if you'd have seen it, you'd be left just as perplexed as I am. For my story, we need to go into a bit of very localized Scottish folklore. I went to a boarding school called Gordonstown in Scotland. The school is built in what used to be the residence of the Gordon family, who were lesser Scottish nobles. Most famously, there was a man called Sir Robert Gordon, a 3rd Baronet, who was referred to as the Wizard of Gordonston. He had an interest in alchemy and the occult, and built a round building known as Round Square, which, in local folklore from Elgin and Duffus, is believed to be the location of where he conducted his magical experiments. They say he sold his soul to a devil and built a round building so that the devil couldn't hide around the corners. One night a devil did come and attempted to claim his soul, and he trapped it in a stone in the center of the square. Eventually, at some point later, a devil came one Hallow's Eve and took his soul, and the wizard was no more. Anyway, when I was in the boarding school, my house was Round Square. We lived in the literal round house where Robert Gordon supposedly trapped a devil in the stone in the middle of it. Well, one Halloween night, me and my floor mates went to this school dance, and on our way back we were talking about the legend of the wizard. So, legend had it that if you took a rock that sat atop of the stone in the center of the square and knocked it 3 times, the devil tapped and would come out. So we tried to see who was brave enough to do it,
Not because we thought a devil would come out, but because you walked in the grass in the center of the square and the seniors would beat the crap out of you. Anyway, I was the dumbass who decided to knock on the stone and nothing happened. So I ran back before the seniors could see me, and we all hung out and chatted, had some sweets and went to bed. At around 3 a.m. I woke up and was completely paralyzed. I could only move my eyes and saw the floor of my room. And then that's when I saw something. Crawling up to me, moving ever so slowly towards me, slowly making its way to my bed, climbing on the stairs at the foot, and crawling on top of me. I could feel its weight on my legs, then my chest, and blowing all the air out my lungs, creeping all the way to my face where I could smell its breath and see that it was a mouth without a face. I could see its teeth, and I wanted to yell, but I couldn't even breathe, it was suffocating. Then suddenly I felt a rush of air sweep my lungs. I yelled to wake up my roommate, and as soon as I could, let out a sound. The thing was gone. I've never had an episode of sleep paralysis before or since, and I don't know if this was just a very creepy coincidence, or something that I pissed off. There was a psycho in our elementary school. It was in grade 5. He lasted 5 months. My friend Matt and I recalled somehow ending up in a room with him and about 5 other kids during a normal class. This classroom was primarily used for storage. We're all talking and the conversation eventually leads to teachers we dislike. One in particular was disliked by all of us, and her name was Mrs. Paul. Eventually, Matt starts talking about how he would like to blow up her car, so he starts gathering stuff from around the room to achieve this. He grabs something that looks like the old keyboard part of a computer, one of the original ones, and gets some other kids to look for things he can attach it to, and is explaining how Part A works with Part B in order to make an explosive. Looking back, it's scary how he truly believed he could have built such a working explosive to take out the person he liked. Well, unsurprisingly to all, 2 weeks later, it was found out that he was expelled, because they found him underneath Mrs. Paul's car, trying to attach something underneath it. This happened last summer. My husband's best friend flew out of LA to visit us in rural Iowa. My husband grew up in LA, but I was raised here, and this is where we decided to settle down. We wanted to give our friend the full rural/small town experience, and one thing you don't realize when you're from the city is how completely pitch black it is out here, with no street lamps or city lights to illuminate the night. It's something my husband commented on when he first moved here. There is a dense forest that covers several square miles just outside of town. It's a protected wildlife reserve. There are a lot of legends about this forest being haunted, because it was the site of a bloody battle between Native American tribes and a burial ground. The creepy old stone tower and dilapidated amphitheater in the middle of the woods are said to be especially haunted. There is also a pond in the heart of the forest that the locals refer to as Dead Man's Lake, because someone drowned in it several years ago and the body was never recovered. I'm not sure if it was accidental or suicide, as I've heard many renditions to the story. I don't believe in ghosts, and I'm not afraid of the dark or the woods, but my husband's friend does. This park technically closes at 10 p.m, but we decided to risk it and took our friend to the forest at midnight on a moonless night. We visited the tower first. I'd never seen it at night, and the sight of the black silhouette against the starry sky, surrounded by gnarled, dead trees, was an unsettling one that set the mood for the rest of the night. After a little convincing, we got our friend to follow us into the tower, up the old, creaky spiral staircase, and we spent some time surveying the surrounding scenery and enjoying our view of the clear night sky from the tower's rooftop. The view was magnificent, and I thought it looked magical, but our friend just seemed to be getting more nervous by the second. We hiked back down the long dirt trail to the car, but kept hearing what sounded like footsteps coming from the trees on both sides and from behind us. Our friend was scared. it could be something paranormal, but I was worried about drug dealers or meth heads, since there is a large population of sketchy people and frequent meth lab busts in the area. My husband and I both had our 9mm pistols strapped to our belts, but we didn't want to have to use them. We picked up our pace, back to the car, and drove further into the forest, to the place where the trail to the old amphitheater begins. Our friend was really on edge now, since the trees are much denser in this part of the forest and it was incredibly dark. We convinced him to follow us down the steep, rocky trail to the amphitheater. When we arrived, I noticed a tall structure standing in the center of the amphitheater that had never been there before, but it was too dark to tell what it was. I had been using only the light of my smartwatch to guide the way, so as to not ruin the eerie illusion created by the inky darkness of the forest with a flashlight beam. At this point, even my husband was becoming uneasy and wanted to turn back, but I had to know what the mysterious object was, which had appeared in the last 2 days since my last hike to this part of the forest. I carefully made my way down into the center of the arena and drew closer to the structure, my husband and our friend following closely behind. When I was a few feet from the object, I lifted my wrist to illuminate it with the light from the watch, and I felt a sense of dread and fear wash over me. Standing before me was a 10-foot-tall wooden arch, strapped with red silk and adorned with animal bones and red roses. The skull of a deer with massive antlers was mounted at its peak. A smaller object that sat lower to the ground that I hadn't seen before looked to be some kind of stone altar. Suddenly, the rustling noises coming from the forest on all sides that I had previously chalked up to animals or the wind seemed much more threatening. My first thought was that it was a malicious cult or a band of Satanists that were lying in wait to sacrifice us to a demon. As ridiculous as it sounds, in that moment it seemed likely impossible thanks to fear. All three of us jumped and turned towards the direction of our car, when we heard a car door close and saw the faint glow of headlights peeking through the trees. We rushed back up the trail expecting to find some crackheads attempting to break into our car. We didn't know whether to be relieved or apprehensive when we saw a DNR truck parked next to our car. The officer was scanning the trees with his flashlight and greeted us and asked us what we were up to. We told him that we were showing our friend around, and he informed us the park was closed. He noticed our firearms and asked for our permits and ID, which we gave him. He went back to his truck to run our info and returned minutes later with an $80 ticket for being in the park past closing time. After that, we spent about 15 minutes having a friendly chat with the officer. When he asked, "So what's the amphitheater like at night?" I told him it was really creepy and proceeded to describe what we witnessed. The officer chuckled at the terrified looks on our faces and told us that a wicker couple had rented the amphitheater for their wedding tomorrow and had been to it today to decorate. So a bit of a disappointment ending, and I was relieved at first but also disappointed, and planned to return to the forest on another night in the dark, but this time I'll go alone, and on foot so the DNR cannot find me. I was in the Gila wilderness, and a convoy of us campers/fishers were making the drive onto the dirt road from Mogollon to Snow Lake, when we spotted a forest ranger guy pulled over looking in a ditch. Turns out some idiots tried to make a U-turn and didn't realize the loose rocks makes it hard to stop. They went over the edge and high-centered. We're miles from the nearest official campground, and it's early spring, and the nighttime gets pretty damn cold. We get a jeep with a winch in position and start to pull the guy out of the ditch. Off a hill comes a white dude in a purple velvet sweatsuit. He's got a walking stick, fanny pack, and the velvet sweatsuit. That's it. He's a blonde dude and pretty skinny, and comes up to us and tells us he's German and having a great time. We couldn't get over the purple velvet suit. It was like a real pimp sweatsuit. The ranger is immediately suspicious, wants to know where he's staying and where he came from. It was around 9 in the morning, and the only way he couldn't gotten where he came from was to hike for hours. The German guy is goofy as hell and points off towards the other mountain where we asked where he's staying and going. We all think it's funny, but also question how the guy is getting along with no water and no food, as the sun is intense above 5,000 feet, even if it's only 75 degrees. The German guy refuses water or any other help, and just crosses the road and goes off into the woods. The ranger told us he can't really keep the guy from doing it since he seemed okay, and said he'd check a few campsites in that direction later to see if he made it. We get to Snow Lake and commence drinking like fish in order to catch fish better. That evening, the ranger pops by to tell us that nobody at any campsite had seen the dude. He radioed around and no other rangers had abandoned camps or missing campers, and they surely hadn't seen a German dude in a purple pimp sweatsuit. That's strange. The ranger rolled off duty the next day and his replacement came by to make sure the other ranger was smoking something we gave him. We assured him it all happened. Never heard another word about the German guy in the purple pimp sweatsuit, but it makes for a good story. I texted my buddy that was with me to reminisce about the German guy, and he reminded me that he looked a lot like the actor Rhys Ifans, who plays Nigel, the kicker, in the Keanu Reeves classic The Replacement. Hope that helps with the mental image. The movie came out 3 years after the camping trip, but we remember seeing the movie and thinking Nigel looked just like the crazy German.
When I was growing up in Rose Meadow, a suburb in Sydney's southwest Australia, my friends and I spent a lot of time exploring the local bushland. While the area had its rough reputation, we made the most of our surrounding and enjoyed our childhood adventures. The bushland was our playground, where we rode bikes, built tree swings and caught frogs. We were quite familiar with the terrain and felt at home in its natural beauty. However, there was always an eerie element to the bushland due to its proximity with the Kilbride nursing home, located on a hill to the west. Security personnel patrolled the area often, chasing us away from that particular section of bush. Behind the nursing home, we discovered unfinished structures that resembled catacombs. These concrete foundations featured cave-like, half-dirt, half-brick structures. It seemed like people had used them for hangout spots, or even made makeshift shelters as we stumbled upon remnants like canned food, old bongs and discarded clothes. Fast forward to 2013 when I was 14. Curiosity got the better of us, and my friends and I hatched a plan to pitch a tent in the bushland away from the nursing home and security patrols. We purchased an affordable tent and set off to our chosen spot, making sure to arrive before sunset. Excited and naive, we indulged in our first experience with marijuana, keeping our plans a secret from everyone, including our parents. As night fell, we gathered around a small fire, each taking a hit from the bong. While my friends engaged in a lively conversation, my heightened senses detected a presence nearby. I became increasingly aware of rustling sounds in the distance, triggering a sense of paranoia. In an attempt to silence my friends, I abruptly shushed them. Before I could finish my sentence, a chilling voice pierced in the darkness, shouting, "I know where you are." The voice had an unsettling, cracking quality to it. Shocked, we exchanged glances, confirming we'd all heard it. Feeling a mix of fear and curiosity, we instinctively sprinted back towards the nursing home, our instincts overriding any desire to investigate further. As we ran through the valley, I caught a glimpse of a dark silhouette resembling a cloaked figure perched on top of the unfinished structures. Though intrigued, I chose not to dwell on it and continued running. Finally, we reached the bushland's exit. We breathed a sigh of relief and looked back only to witness a white apparition emerging at the bottom of the hill, heading in our direction. Filled with a sense of urgency, we sprinted back to my house, which was conveniently nearby. We all shared the same bewildered and terrified experience, confirming the reality of what we had encountered. That night, we opted to stay at my house, reluctant to venture back into the bush until daylight.
The following day, we returned to the tent to clear up our belongings. Despite the previous night's unsettling encounter, we couldn't resist the allure of the bushlands during daylight hours. While playing near a tree swing about 15 meters from where our tent had been, we were startled by a blood-curdling scream that appeared to be that of a young girl, followed by the revving sound of a chainsaw. We peered through the dense shrubbery, unable to see much beyond the thick vegetation. The location seemed inaccessible with no clear path or flat ground. Filled with fear, we ran back to my house, enlisting my dad's help to bring along our dog to search the area. Interestingly, as we reached my house, we encountered an old man of Chinese descent riding a bike wearing a bucket as a makeshift helmet. This eccentric sight had always amused me. However, as we had seen the man around town before, this time his presence near my house felt unsettling. The way he looked at me made me feel uneasy, adding to the strange events we had experienced. With my dog in tow, we ventured back to the bushlands hoping to find some answers, but despite our efforts we found no trace of the girl or any indication of a chainsaw-wielding maniac. These experiences left me perplexed and questioning my own sanity. Were we all collectively experiencing some sort of shared psychosis? And what did the role of the enigmatic Chinese man in the bucket play in all of this, if any? The truth remains elusive to this day. The events were undeniably strange, and the presence of the dark energies or entities connected to the nursing home added to the mystery. If anyone hearing this has any similar encounters in the Rosemeadow bushland, I would appreciate hearing your stories, and perhaps together we can shed some light on these inexplicable phenomena.
My name is Lindsay, and I'm a 19-year-old female living in Pennsylvania with my parents and my 2 sisters. We live in a pretty rural area, and there isn't much that goes on out there. To preface this, me and my older sisters have only been hiking one time before this experience, and are by no means pros. We do, however, always bring some items such as pocket knives, flashlights, and medical kits for safety. My older sister is called Mary, and it so happened that today was my younger sister, Felicity's birthday. She had never been hiking before, and we figured we would bring her on a little hiking trip to take advantage of the beautiful weather. The area we hiked prior to this is part of the state game lands. Hikers are permitted on the mountain trails during the off-season of hunting. However, not many folks know about this spot because there are no signs or anything until you walk the mile or so into the woods. By then you reach a small parking lot of sorts which is always empty. There are 2 main trails that are marked with the occasional blue dot on a nearby tree. We were decently excited and ready to have a nice relaxing hike through the mountains and hopefully get some cool pictures. We started walking from our house all the way to the bottom of the mountain, where we would begin our hike. On our way there, we were telling Felicity about the trail and how beautiful it was. Mary then expresses concerns that there could be animals of all sorts nearby because the area isn't normally frequented by many humans. I figured there would be animals, of course. It is the woods after all, but I never imagined anything like what I'm about to describe. After wandering for about 15 minutes, we reached the parking lot. Mary led the way, with me into the middle, and Felicity followed closely behind. The first couple of steps onto the trail require you to walk up a small but steep hill. Mary crested the hill before Felicity and I, and as she did, we heard a pretty loud rustling noise off to our left. I naturally chalked the noise up to some birds or maybe a squirrel messing around in a tree, but then Mary suddenly stopped in her tracks, causing Felicity to also briefly pause. Just as I was about to ask what the problem was, Mary calmly told us to turn around. Felicity and I looked at her in confusion, not understanding what she meant. I just started asking why, and she said probably the scariest thing I've ever heard. "There's something over there. Run." Now, that sentence might not be that scary to you, but it was a lot more scary to me, given the context and situation I was in. And we know Mary very well, and she doesn't scare easily.
so to hear the clear panic in her voice as she ordered us to run away from something that neither Felicity or I saw was quite terrifying. Mary and Felicity immediately began sprinting down the small hill as I was standing in my place. I quickly looked behind me but saw nothing. I did hear something though. I was still very confused because I hadn't actually seen anything, and Mary never said what she saw. I ran over to Mary and Felicity, who were waiting for me just before the entrance to the parking lot. I think part of the reason I hesitated running right away was because I thought Mary might be exaggerating a little. I should have known by the look on her face that she wasn't messing around. I had a miniature hatchet, multi-tool, and a pocket knife on my belt, and you better believe I had them ready. I had no idea what I was expecting, but I knew that whatever might run out of the woods behind us was going to get a face full of stainless steel. When I reached my sisters, I asked Mary what exactly we were running from. She told us to just keep moving, and she constantly looked back at the trail we had just come from. And she told us to just jog in case it was following us. We did, after maybe jogging a quarter mile or so. That was when Mary finally told us what we were running from. She said she looked in the direction of the noise we had all heard, and that what she saw was a grey figure hunched over about 10 feet off the trail. She described it as being at least the height of Felicity, who was 5'6". She said it looked bipedal, but she didn't stick around long enough to take in every detail about the figure. However, she did note that it looked as if it was shuffling towards us. I believe that's what made her get out of there so fast. She must have feared that we were being chased. Now, I've never believed in monsters or cryptids or anything, but Mary said she honestly has no idea what the thing was. We don't even have that type of animal in Pennsylvania that matches the description, at least not as far as I'm aware. I know that black bears stand on their hind legs sometimes, but they are not grey, and it did not sound big enough to be a bear. The only other thing it may have been is a human. But why would someone hear us obviously distressed and not call out and let us know they were there and not a threat? Unless the person was not a friendly hiker. Possibly a person living on the mountain, maybe someone on drugs afraid to be busted. I don't know. That seems to be the only logical explanations for me. But I'm still not fully convinced it was a person. I don't believe in Bigfoot per se, but who knows? By the time we were almost home, Mary told us she used to go to the bus stop with 2 of the neighborhood kids. She said they would always talk about a mystery animal that they would see walking around the woods near their house, which was very close to the state game lands. At first she didn't believe in them because she had never seen such a thing. But one time with the neighbor's kid's grandmother, Mary asked about this mystery animal. The grandmother had always been a very religious person and didn't seem to be the type of person to believe in something like her grandkids explained. But to Mary's surprise, the grandmother said she had also witnessed the mystery animal lurking around. What's more, our house is just across the lawn from where our neighbors claimed this spot was. I'm not sure if these 2 experiences are related. Besides, that was years ago. But could the figure Mary encountered in the woods tonight be the mystery animal? Maybe it was a human or an animal, but who knows for sure. What I do know is I don't think I will be hiking on the state game lands anytime soon again. I don't believe in ghosts. I believe in bad energy and stuff. But I do believe in shadow people. Why? I've seen them. So, one of the first times I can remember seeing a shadow person was in 5th grade. I went to a pretty exclusive private school and we took a lot of field trips. Well, one trip I'll never forget. We went to the dunes of Michigan in the middle of winter. I don't know whose bright idea this was, but it was like a deserted summer camp. One of the counselors did teach us about crushing wintergreens, lifesavers, in the dark, and you could see sparks, so that was pretty cool. He did it in the woods, so it was pretty neat to see as a 5th grader. The camp was covered with snow, and as I said, was probably rocking during the summer, but at winter, eating in a dining hall, made for 6 times as many children and a skeleton crew of staff was a little haunting. The place was kind of old too,
The building was definitely mid-20th century and creaked and groaned. One counselor wasn't one of our teachers, it was a real counselor from the camp, and one night we had to sleep in a cabin that segregated the boys and girls. The counselor was actually a cool guy and probably smoked grass and never had a desk job in his life, so we liked him. But he assigned us bunks. I was against the wall on the back side of the cabin top bunk. There were 2 rows of bunk beds, probably 6 to a side. I was pretty stoked about having a top bunk and having the wall next to me, although the counselor was by the door in the front of the cabin, of course. This was the 80s, and no second door fire escape. He slept on the left side of the bottom bunk, which made sense being by the door and at ground level. Now this place was really far from north in Michigan, at the top of the index finger of the mitten shape of the state, but not the UP, and it was really quiet and dark. When the counselor turned off the cabin lights, there was nearly no light. The only light was from the outbuilding about 50 yards away, a typical sodium outdoor bulb. So us boys settled down and felt a bit restless, and couldn't really sleep that great, and I wasn't even sure if I fell asleep, but I looked towards the door and there it was, a shadow person. The shadow person was probably 7 feet tall, because when he started walking he had to bend down every time. He looked down to a boy. It was like he was checking on them, and then moved to the next bunk. I obviously couldn't believe what I was seeing and was totally petrified. The shadow person was moving at a leisurely rate, not fast, not slow, and only paying attention to the boy who he was checking out. As he or it got closer, I had a better look at him. He wasn't really detailed. He was static or fuzzy on the edges. Ridiculous as it may sound, he kind of looked like a stick figure, but all black as night. I could only make him out because of the light through the first 2 windows of the cabin, with the residual light from the outbuilding. As he creeped closer and closer to my bed, I was paralyzed with fear. I felt like I couldn't even say anything or move if I wanted to. A little odd too it was as though someone turned down the volume, because before you could hear the kids tossing and turning, but now it was silent. As I stated, I was on the last bed to the right side of the top bunk. The shadow man made it to the top bunk next to mine, but it seemed like an eternity as his movements were just so slow. Up until this point, everything was on the rails, checking one bed to the next, so maybe I could have explained it away, but as he checked the top of the second to the last bunk next to mine, he abruptly looked away. The way he was moving, he should have gone to the left side, second to last, to be uniform, but instead, his body/head tilted towards me. He kind of cocked his head like a dog when they're confused. He then inched closer and closer at a much slower pace, like he was sneaking on me. I assure you, my eyes were wide open. I was clinging to my itchy baby blue woolen blanket and sheet, and had them yanked up past my nose, up to my eyes, where the top of the head was. Then the shadowy man's face got closer to mine, and there was honestly nothing to make out. It was just an empty void of space, shaped like a person, but as his head approached me, I couldn't see his body any longer. At this point, I felt like 10 degrees colder. My heart was racing. I couldn't make sense of anything. I didn't know why anyone else was experiencing this. I felt like I was between the cracks and seeing something I shouldn't. The blackness of his head totally engulfed me in what seemed like an instant, and then suddenly it was morning and light outside and everyone was waking up. When I referred to this story a few times since, I called him the Sandman, because it was like an entity was making sure we were asleep, but he caught me awake and knocked me out. This is the story of how my boyfriend decided he was not an outdoorsy type of person. Let me take you back. My boyfriend, sweet as he may be, went on a small camping trip with one of his close friends, Matt. And after a successful 2 days of camping and hiking, which he loved, he impressed upon me the importance of getting with nature and going out and exploring the wilderness, something which I had never done before. It didn't really interest me all that much. Sure, parks are nice, but spending nights out in the wilderness certainly wasn't something that sounded that appealing to me. But he persisted,
And so around Valentine's Day weekend, he arranged everything. He got the gear off his friend, and we were going to spend the weekend out in the sticks. Honestly, our day didn't go according to plan. As we began making our way there, we ended up getting lost, as it was in an area that had very little signal, and if you didn't know where you're going, getting lost was only too easy. It took about an extra hour until we managed to find the right road, and it was already past midday at this point. We stopped in a little town, had food, and then finally made our way towards our destination. Now, I should probably point out that being February, it gets dark quite quickly. And that being the case, it was already starting to get dark. So, my boyfriend, who roughly remembers where he had camped with his friend, insists that we must follow the trail to get to this amazing spot, a lovely place to wake up. We gather all the gear and walk in the dusk towards our destination. I tried to be optimistic for his sake. I wasn't having a great time because walking in near darkness at this point with only a flashlight to guide us wasn't exactly my idea of fun, but tried to be optimistic in the hopes that I would be wrong. As we carried on walking, my boyfriend inevitably got lost, and after about half an hour of looking for the spot he had planned on, we settled on just hunkering down wherever we could find a good space, which didn't take all that long. But now we didn't know where we were, or he for that matter. We had ventured far off the trail in the hopes to find the location his friend had promised him in the dark. And although we didn't feel super great, we figured that come light, we should be able to find our way back. So we set up our tent with much difficulty given the darkness and our one flashlight, and eventually had a little bite to eat before falling asleep. I, however, found it hard to get to sleep. My boyfriend seemingly just put himself in his sleeping bag and passed out no problemo. I, on the other hand, had never been outside before when I needed to sleep. I was always in the quiet of my room, and hearing all the outside noises while I was trying to sleep. Every time my boyfriend moved, it made a rustle on the ground from the fallen leaves. It bothered me, and I found it very hard to get comfortable and fall asleep because of it. So I lie there awake, staring at the darkness, hoping that eventually sleep would come for me. I don't know how much time passed. I was in and out of consciousness. It felt like every noise woke me. But suddenly I heard what was unmistakably footsteps in the distance. My ears perked up, and I lie there listening, now more awake than ever. There were people, but I couldn't see any flashlights as they would be very visible through the canvas of the tent. As I listened, I could hear two men talking. They sounded a bit drunk, to be fair. One of them I heard fall over, and they were definitely approaching our direction. Suddenly, I saw what appeared to be the beam of a flashlight shine over and not directly touch our tent, but it was clear they'd seen us, as one man started shushing his friend. They started going, shh, 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 and talking in hushed tones. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but I was fairly sure that it was something to do with ambushing our tent, or at least looting it. At this point, I just about crapped a brick. I felt true fear, the likes of which I don't think I'd ever felt in my life surge through me. Here were people with bad intentions, and I was out here in the dark, basically alone because my boyfriend sleeps like a log, with my only protection being a flashlight, while these two men approach us both to do who knows what with who knows what, and I really didn't want to find out. I frantically look around while trying to make as minimal noise as possible. Do I have any form, any way to defend myself? We didn't bring anything. No mace, no weapon, no knife, Nothing. We decided to pack light, and it being quite rural, we didn't think anything bad would happen, least of all animals, as there aren't any dangerous animals where we live. Humans never came into the equation, which was our mistake. I grabbed my power bank, which is heavy and probably the only thing that's heavy enough to hurt if it hits someone on the head, and I grabbed it in my hand like the brick it is, and waited as I moved silently towards the flap of the tent in case someone stuck their head in. I've realized that if they shined their flashlight, they'd be able to see exactly where I was in the tent, and that concerned me. But figured if that were to pass, I'd just lie down as quick as I could in the hopes to remain unspotted. And there I waited, as the shuffling feet drew ever closer in the silence of the forest. The men had now reached the tent, shushing each other and walking around it slowly. Thankfully, they didn't shine the flashlight into the tent, probably because they wanted to check to see if anyone was in there and not wake them, in case we were the ones who were going to prove dangerous. As I waited, anxiety and anticipation flooding every neuron of my brain and every cell of my being, filling me with pure primal dread, did I hear the sound of the zipper slowly come undone. I waited, in the darkness, for anyone to push their head through to check if we were there. And right as a solitary head started making its way through the zipper, I smashed him in the head with the power bank. A sound emanated, a crunch, the likes of which I could have never anticipated either. I smacked him directly on the nose with as much force as my adrenaline-fueled hand could muster, and the scream that erupted from this man was more like a roar as he fell backwards and started yelling at his friend to get the hell out of there. I looked down at my power bank, and despite the fact it was a moonless night and I could barely see anything, I could feel the blood on it and could almost taste it in the air. The men screamed and ran, almost like we'd assaulted them, and my boyfriend, obviously woken from the commotion, asked what the hell happened. When he realized what happened, we started dismantling the tent and told ourselves it was time to leave. Once he'd done that, and everything had been packed away, it was still dark, and we used our flashlight to try and find where we were going, but the problem still persisted. We had absolutely no clue. We stood there in the dark, waiting, wondering what the hell our next move should be. So, in the little clearing that we'd found, we moved over to near some trees, put our bags behind them, and tried to be as hidden as possible, and just lied together down in the grass, waiting for the sun to shine so that we could make our exit quickly. As we waited in the darkness, we heard footsteps farther and further away. We were worried that they would return, but they never did. When the first rays of dawn started arriving, we looked around and made our way to try and find where we'd come from. When we got back through our little clearing, we noticed a startling amount of blood just on the floor where our tent was, and a clear trail. I assumed that these people, if they were walking around in the woods in the middle of the night, probably had some inkling where to go, and following a trail of blood. And just to paint the proper picture, it wasn't a huge flowing trail, it was just the occasional droplet by that point. We managed to find our way eventually to the path. It took us twice as long to leave as it did when we arrived, but I was grateful nonetheless to have gone. The end of our camping saga, filled with misfortune. I suppose it just wasn't meant to be. And with that, I conclude the story. My boyfriend and I made it home safely and decided it would probably be best to never go camping again, which to this day we haven't done. Stay safe out there. And to anyone wandering the woods in the middle of the night, hoping to take advantage or rob anyone while camping, let's not meet. As a forest worker, I actually have a few stories that are going to creep you out. The biggest one was in northeastern British Columbia, up near the Alberta border about as far north as Fort Nelson, but no summer roads because it is a giant swamp up there. We flew in with a helicopter, and 2 of us girls got dropped in a block. The helicopter dropped us all first thing in the morning, and was coming back in the afternoon, because he had another job in the middle. So my partner goes one way to the end of the block, and I head to the far end so we can start working towards each other. I get down there doing my thing when suddenly I hear screaming, yelling, swearing, and a lot of bad, all in a female voice. Now the lady I worked with was not a swearing person, and I had never seen her angry, and this person was angry. I tried yelling back to see what was wrong, to receive no answer. Then my partner radios me to find out what's wrong, as she can hear this on the wind. I had to explain to her that it wasn't me either. We decided to work together that day. It never quit until the helicopter came back and dropped off a load of our guys to help us finish off our block. Just before they landed, we heard a couple of quads speed away in the bush. We ended up with about 15 people on that block to help finish it. A helicopter flew around to find the person to see if they were in need of help, but could not even see a trail out of the block. The roads were thorough, pure muskeg swamp, and not passable by foot due to standing water and quick mud. And saying that one is my creepiest. I have even been shot at, had a pack of wolves track me for hours after killing something in my block, been stalked by bears and found dead animals, including one that was gutted and dropped so close to the driver's door of our truck that we had to crawl in from the passenger side, and my poor co-worker that I had needed to phone RCMP for one day as he had to come back to the office freaked out because he found a couple of pairs of skeletal feet in running shoes one day. Turns out, after some investigation, someone had shoved bear paws in shoes, which just begs the question, why? At least, they weren't human. This was in British Columbia, at the start of the feet washing up on shore of the coast too. My boyfriend Jason and I went on a month-long camping trip to multiple states. Everything had been going really well until October 9th. We decided to ditch a campground reservation and randomly pitch our tent near Albion Basin within the Uinta Mountains. It was the Secret Lake Trailhead, or not far from it. We parked our car around 3 p.m. at the Albion Basin campground, closed for some reason. Admittedly, I was a little tense because this was our first dispersed camping attempt, as we had no proper backpacking gear. Upon arrival, we realized the area we wanted to pitch our tent in was 2 miles uphill. At this point, we started to express regret, as we had a planned campsite in Nepi, Utah, which we decided to skip on a whim. After grumping around a bit and having a large lunch to avoid packing food, we packed our backpacks with the best gear we had to get through the night, as it was going to be around 25 Fahrenheit. We set up the trail, seeing the occasional family or couple heading down the mountain. As we trudged on, we both started to feel strange, as if we did not really even know why we were doing this, as if we should have just gotten a hotel instead of trying to play backpackers for the night. But we both felt like we had something to prove, so we continued. Fast forward, we made it up to Secret Lake, totally empty, so nothing like the pictures, disappointing and eerie. Whatever. We kept hiking up in an attempt for seclusion and flat land, when we stumble across a decent space. I see a small cave in the distance and point it out to Jason to debate if it's a hell no kind of situation, but after he checks it out, he says it seems like a small animal crawl space, no biggie. We set it up as nightfall was quickly approaching, play some cards, bundle up, and decide to go to bed early around 8:30 p.m. as we plan to leave ASAP in the morning at around 5 a.m. We both dwindle slowly, and after what feels like half an hour, I woke up abruptly at 11:24. I woke up with a feeling that I've never experienced before. I woke up wide awake, scared but unprovoked, as if there was no way in hell I was going to fall back asleep. When I was sleeping through the night, Jason was asleep, so I let him be and just lie there, trying to listen to anything I could hear, which was nothing, just very silent. Around midnight, Jason woke up stirring. Much to my delight, as I did not want to feel alone anymore, I told him I could not sleep, but he suggested I just rest my eyes as we were leaving early in the morning. I agreed, initially not wanting to be a baby and say that I was very scared. This was very short-lived, as Jason could not fall back asleep himself, and we ended up just laying together trying to sleep, when I ended up blurting out that I was scared. We agreed it's fine for us to just stick it through the night, as it was approaching 2:30 a.m, and we had a small hand axe and a pellet gun for protection, so we need not be frightened. About 5 minutes later, we're wide awake, when Jason's head perks up super fast that my heart jumped out of my chest and I whispered, "What is it?" "Listen." I kid you not. We distinctly heard the sound of gravel crunching under boots, as if someone walked up to our tent, stopped and then walked to the other side of it. I felt the blood drain out my face in an instant. In real time, this all occurred in no more than 10 seconds, but my mind flashed up a million thoughts, and for a millisecond I was convinced it was a ranger coming to tell us we couldn't camp there, so I called out, "Hello?" My brain entirely sure I heard a human footstep. Within 2 to 3 seconds of hearing the footstep, Jason grabbed the gun and burst through the tent in order for a chance to confront this person, as I knew he had heard exactly what I did. But there was nothing at all. As soon as Jason burst out, and me after him, there was nothing there. We heard something walk up so clearly, but nothing walked away. Hardly exchanging 2 words, we packed up our stuff, looking over our shoulders, terrified, feeling watched, and booked it down the mountain with only moonlight guiding our way. Too scared to turn on our flashlights, this was the worst 20 to 30 minutes of my life, half expecting to look over my shoulder to find someone following us. When we made it to our car, we locked the doors and started the descent out of the mountains, almost speechless and scared out of our minds. At this point, we reached town at around 3:30 a.m. and slept in a well-lit parking lot of a grocery store. We have obviously since discussed what happened that night, and are both haunted by the sounds of those footsteps. A few years ago, I was down on my luck in life, and through a series of circumstances ended up living in the woods on some state land as a last resort. Given my vantage point, I could easily hear cars approaching this stop from a mile away, and there weren't more than a few houses within walking distance, so I usually knew when there were people around me. Interestingly enough, there was a nearby spot where I found an old cobblestone foundation about 50 yards from my camp, and every night I saw what looked like an oil lantern where a match would strike even in the wind, and the lantern would light. The match would then go out, and the lantern would bob forward for about 15 steps, and the light would disappear. I went to see if there was anyone there, first by going to see the lot if there were any cars, and I tried walking out into the woods after it, and it just kept blowing out and relighting a little further away each time. As you can imagine, I turned around pretty quickly, but I was certain enough that there was no one out there blowing out and relighting a little further away. When that happened, I turned around pretty quickly, but was certain there was still no one there. I'm not all about ghosts and stuff, but I have no logical explanation for what it was that I witnessed that night. As seniors in high school, my BFF and I spent the night in the school after everyone had packed up and gone home. My mum thought I was staying at my best friend's house and vice versa. We were the type of kids parents trusted. We camped out in the Corrali room because it had a secure closet shared with the band room with locking doors if things got creepy. We talked, laughed, ate sugary treats, and drank copious amounts of Jolt. The lights in the hall remained on until around 1 a.m, where they were shut off several times in a row. We started to freak out a little bit because while this went on, someone in the hall shouted loudly. The door to our room opened slowly and we quickly ran to the couch next to the secret closet. We sat there absolutely still, and watched a custodian come in to start sweeping the room. He walked exactly perpendicular to where we sat and looked through us as if we weren't even there. He stared in the exact spot we were sitting but didn't notice. We ran into the closet and quietly closed the door. We struggled with going home or staying. The secure closet has an exit to the outdoors, but it was so late that neither of us would be able to justify strolling into our respective homes. We watched the same custodian, whom we'd never seen before tonight, clean the band room through the window in the closet door. He finally left and we nervously checked the windows of the doors until dawn broke. We finally thought it was a reasonable enough time to exit, as classes would be starting soon. We'd headed over to the Dunkin' Donuts for a caffeinated drink and a donut. As we walked through the breezeway that separated the 9th to 10th graders from the 11th to 12th graders to stop at our lockers, we found 3 tall pink candles lit on the oversized sill, 2 hockey sticks crossed on the ground, and weird music playing from a cassette player from 1999. We booked it out of there as quickly as we could, and never saw the custodian again. Several years back, on a bright winter afternoon, I decided to take my nephew, who was 7 at the time, and my son of 3, and my dog on a short hike at a local park. We were walking through the woods on a trail when my dog started barking. I looked over to see a man standing in the woods about 50 feet away facing us. I couldn't see his face because he had one of those fur-lined hoods on, so with the distance and the shadows from the trees in his hood, from my perspective, there was nothing but a black hole where his face should be. I gave an awkward wave, but he remained motionless, and I had a weird feeling, so I decided to just keep moving and make our own way back to the car. I felt like we were being watched, so we looked back a few minutes later, and the man was just standing in the woods. But I knew he had moved because he was still about 50 feet away, and we had gone quite a way. My dog was growling, and the kids and I were starting to be creeped out. We kept moving and I suddenly hear the sound of fast, heavy footsteps in the snow. I look back, and this time I caught the guy running in our direction, but he stopped as soon as I saw him and went back to just staring motionlessly from afar, now closer than he was before. My dog was going nuts at this point, and my mind was racing with possibilities. So I discreetly gave my nephew my phone and quietly told him that if anything happened, he needed to take his cousin and run as fast as they could to the car and call for help. I figured if anything, the dog and I could at least hold the guy off for long enough for the kids to get away. I think my dog may have scared him off because he ended up turning around and going in the opposite direction. I never really told anyone because I didn't want to come off as being dramatic, but it certainly frightened the hell out of me, as anyone who's being followed can probably relate to. I was a parks officer for a downtown metropolitan out in the Pacific Northwest. I saw my fair share of weird stuff on my 5 p.m. to 1 a.m. shifts, whether it be naked bike rides after parties at midnight, with about 1,000 or so naked people chilling out, the occasional couple going at it, a homeless guy attending to himself or perhaps shooting up, as well as the occasional dead body, was all a part of the normal job. This one night, we were sent to investigate a tent set up relatively near the waterfront, which was generously a homeless person that was trying to stray dry for the night. So we get there around 11:30 and tell the lady inside that she has to go a few hundred yards away to an area that isn't patrolled. She fusses and complains about having to move, then mentions a man living in a cave at the bottom of a shallow ravine nearby that has been killing small animals and eating them. We ask her for more information, and she points to a general area about 50 yards away through some thick brush, the general area most people wouldn't wander past. My partner and I started to walk through the thick brush with just our flashlights, and eventually stumble upon the ravine. And sure enough, there's a small opening on the side, enough for a person to fit in. I scale down about 20 feet and peek inside the opening and see what looks like a massive pile of magazines, torn pages, article of clothing, a sugar cookie tin, a gorilla costume hand, some crude-looking tools including a makeshift bow, a few knives and other generally weird stuff. Being curious and that the cave was empty, I opened the sugar cookie tin and found large amounts of what seemed to be raw animal meat. At this point I was thoroughly freaked out and decided to unask the area and informed the police of what I had found, as we didn't carry weapons. We never found what came of the guy who was staying there, or what was going on, but it was definitely freaky at midnight, in pitch black conditions. My husband and I made a decision to camp in a secluded campground where no one else seemed to be around. As we arrived, we noticed that the gate to the area was strangely open, and the place appeared deserted. It was early in the season, March to be exact, and we assumed that the gate had been accidentally left open. Despite this, we thought it might be a unique opportunity to enjoy some peaceful moments in a typically crowded campground. During the night, our slumber was abruptly interrupted by unsettling noises. To our surprise and alarm, 2 trucks with their headlights on pulled into the camp, and individuals hopped out of their beds wielding flashlights. Fear washed over us as we contemplated the intentions of the unexpected visitors. It may sound irrational, but we couldn't help but worry about the possibility of them finding us and causing harm. For me, it's the actions of fellow humans that can be even more unnerving than the unpredictability of nature. With trepidation, we watched as they wandered around the area for a while, their flashlights scanning the surroundings. Fortunately, they eventually returned to their trucks and departed without spotting our tent nestled among the trees towards the back of the campground. But let me tell you, the scare we experienced left us on high alert and ready to pack up and leave at a moment's notice. While it's possible they were merely checking out the campground with intention to stay, the whole atmosphere felt eerie and unsettling, as if they were searching for something in particular. Growing up, I lived behind an old cemetery, and our house backed up to a wooded area with a creek. My cousins lived on the same street, just 2 houses down, so us and our neighborhood friends played in the woods a whole lot. All of our yards backed up to the trees, and it was like a long and skinny stretch of tree around a creek. But it was obvious that someone or something walked those trails often, as it almost seemed as if someone was taking care of the worn-out path. But other than the following 2 stories, I never saw anything or anyone in the woods, and our town and neighborhood were very safe. The first story happened when 7 or 8 of us were playing hide and seek, and we split into 3 groups. The eldest of us was my brother, who was around 15. Up to that point, because we had never seen anyone or anything else in there, we had never had any indication that the woods weren't safe. So as I was saying, we were playing hide and seek, and I was teamed up with my cousin who was 13, I was 10, and my younger cousin of 8. I honestly can't remember if we were doing the hiding or the seeking, but we all saw this thing. At first, I thought it was one of the other kids walking across the trail, but it was as dark as night, and all of us were wearing brightly colored clothes. It was walking, or maybe crawling on all 4s, and as tall as a deer, but it wasn't one. I didn't see what its head looked like, thank goodness, as it was low in the brush. Now the woods aren't that thick, and we never saw this thing do anything but cross the path. It's like it disappeared into thin air once it had completely crossed the trail. We sat there for a second, just staring at the place it had crossed, before my older cousin asked if we saw it too, and of course we had. The younger cousin started crying, and we grabbed onto each other to run. Luckily, we were literally right behind someone's house, so we ran up the side of a house back onto our street. A few of the dads went to gather the boys and brought them home. We asked to make sure it wasn't one of them playing a trick on us, and they swore that it wasn't. We believed them. This was a few years later. The trees had been thinned out a lot, as they were pouring streets and building a new neighborhood on the other side of the creek. But buildings hadn't started yet besides that. As I said, we routinely hung out in the woods with our friends. Well, one day I was on the other side of the creek, closest to the new neighborhood with my friend. We used to build little clubhouses down there and make mud pies and whatnot. So we were on the other side of the creek finding supplies when we heard someone crashing through the woods. We crouched down, looking over some tall grass, and went silent. A man came running through the woods. Not even on the trail, he was looking over his shoulder frantically as he ran. I don't know why, but it freaked us out so much. We were only 20 yards from my backyard, so we stayed crouching and hiding for a few minutes before we took off running back home. Not a big thing. Obviously, there's a logical explanation for the second story, but the first one really shook us. Any ideas on what it could have been would be appreciated.
This happened in the late 90s, maybe early noughties. It was probably when I was between 8 to 10 years old and in the Cub Scouts. Our troop would pretty much always go to the same campground. They had maybe 8 to 10 big cabins, and each cabin had a small kitchen, a dining area with 4 to 6 picnic tables, and a giant room with about a dozen bunk beds lined up along the 2 walls. There would be a wood-burning stove in the center. In our troop, all of the boys' dads would go camping too. The dads would take the bottom bunk, and the boys would be on top. This particular time, we got to a corner bunk closest to the front door. My best friend and his dad, a Vietnam vet and tough guy, were in the bunk over. So a little bit about me. I've always been a very shy and socially anxious person. I only ever really spoke when spoken to by an adult, and only really talked much with my best friend. This was just a one-nighter camping field trip, and after a normal day it was now bedtime. It's cold out there, so it's a fire in the stove casting a warm reddish glow around the big room, but it's still dark inside anyway. I couldn't remember if I couldn't fall asleep or if I woke up, but the point is I was awake. The whole room was dimly lit, and it was like shooting stars in a light show above the room, in the peaks and above the bunks. It looked like a massive party. I couldn't believe it. I look over at my friend to see if he's awake, and he's sound asleep. I look back at the light show, and a dimly lit light swoops down and comes towards me. As it gets closer, I see a little girl's face, but with big, 2 to 3 inch black circles at her eyes. Her face is about a foot from mine, and we just stare at each other. It was kind of like the ghostly apparition that comes out of the Ark in Indiana Jones, but she didn't transform and was not menacing. I don't remember if she was floating or if I was just looking down at her on the floor as she looked up at me. I didn't do or say anything. I didn't scream or try to wake anyone. I'm not sure if I was frozen or didn't want to bother anyone, but was just very curious. And after staring at each other for a little while, I start to freak out, wondering what I should do. So I roll over, face the wall, close my eyes, and eventually get to sleep. We all left the next morning. I did not feel good, and never told anyone about it. A few years later, on another camping trip, some of the kids were talking about ghosts, and I guess there was a rumor that one of the cabins was haunted. I bet I can tell anyone for free which one it was specifically. There's a giant forest right next to my house, and there will be times when the mood takes me that I will go down there to draw, chill, and take pictures. One time I was lying on a hammock that was set up by the people who last lived there. Just as I was chilling, I lost my balance and regrettably fell out of the hammock. Right before I fell, I saw a knife sticking straight up in the air, planted in the dirt so it would stick right up. The knife did not stab me, but it caught on my sweater, and I was thinking just how lucky I was. Right by the knife, there was a wooden cross, a 6 by 6 foot wooden cross, and as you can imagine, after this terrifying incident, I elected to not go back into the forest anymore for fear of my own safety and the absolute creepiness of some people. I was a park ranger and wildlife officer in a mountain state.
I don't want to give out too much info due to high tourists and co-workers I still talk to, but the area I worked in had campsites and cabins. One night on patrol, at approximately 11:15, I got a call from dispatch about one of the cabins calling in saying something was outside harassing them. There were not too many people in the area, and it was mid-spring, and there was still some snow on the ground in some parts. Anyway, I arrived on site a few minutes later. In order to reach the cabins, you have to walk up a dirt path for about 25 to 30 yards from when you park your vehicle. Surrounding the trail and cabins is all forest. As I walked up the path, I had a very, very strange feeling of being watched, and my anxiety was going up. I arrived at the small cabin to see the fire pit was still smoldering, and lanterns and flashlights were moving around inside. I walked up the steps and knocked on the door, identifying myself. The door slowly opened up, and a lady that appeared to be in her late 30s answered. I asked her what was going on. She walked inside fast and was going on about the kids in the window. I came inside and noticed another lady around the same age, and a few children ranging from ages 5 to 9, all of them wearing a look of utmost terror. The younger kids were crying. Both mothers were on full-on mum alert. For those of you who don't know what that is, it's the look and attitude of, I'll kill what tries to get my kids. She told me herself and friend's husband were up north on a hiking trail to fish in a lake and camp as they stayed at the cabin with their younger kids. When the kids were playing a game on the floor and the mothers were talking, when they heard the kids screaming and crying, the sound of horror, not "she took my toy" kind of cry. Both women ran to the children to see what happened. One of the older kids there said there was a big, dark man who was looking at them through the window and tapped on it. The lady pointed to the area, and I walked up to it. The oldest son told me it was up there and pointed to the top right corner. I took down the description from both mothers and children and went outside to check the area. As I walked around, I had my .40 caliber in hand, ready to go, because I was freaked out and still had the feeling of being watched. I yelled out to the park law enforcement officer who was out there as I shined my flashlight around. I went up to the window to see if there were any tracks, footprints, or a ladder indentation, thinking maybe it was a perv watching the kids. These windows were at least 8+ feet off the ground, but I didn't see a track nor a scuff mark in the dirt. I walked about 10 yards into the woods, looking for anything out of the ordinary. The only thing that was noticeable was my uneasy feeling. I went back and informed the family. I saw some game trails and played it cool, as I could say it was most likely a black bear, and gave my wildlife lecture on bears, people, food, and spring. I know the mothers saw right through me, but it calmed the kids. I went out to the porch with one of the ladies who asked if I had any idea what it was. I told her no, that I was stumped, but that I would be in the area until my shift ends, and that I would pass it on to the other officers, and to call back if there was another incident. I went back to my patrol truck in a speed walk, almost a jog, and called my dispatcher and the gate officers and informed them of what happened, saying I think it was a bear. I went to my personal truck, where in the back seat, in a locked gun box, I had my .45-70, and kept it with me for the remainder of the shift. I have a degree in biology. I don't believe in Bigfoot or Sasquatch, and have spent most of my life outdoors. I've had my fair share of run-ins with bears, mountain lions, bobcats, coyote, deer, elk, and moose, to name a few. I've dealt with aggressive bears on and off my job from Alaska to the lower 48. Nothing has given me as much fear Not even a deployment to the Middle East when I was in the army. I told my supervisor the whole story, knowing I won't seem crazy to him because he was a good friend. I was worried that my coworker would think some little woodland creature came and spooked me in the woods at midnight, but he gave me his 2 cents and said he believed me, and that it could have been a Sasquatch. Like I said, I don't really believe in any of that. I've never seen any evidence for myself, and to this day still have no idea what that was. The only thing I can say is to always carry a weapon when you go out into the woods, because you never know what's watching you. One time, my buddy and I were camping around Diamond Lake in Oregon. I can't remember the exact name of the site, but it was around that area. This was the off-season, and we were the only really ones camping around this lake. It was pitch black out there, and with the exception of our campfire, it was just pure darkness. So around 1 in the morning, we're just chilling and smoking. The area we were at had a hill just above us with a lot of trees and bushes on it. We're sitting there when we start hearing a crackling sound and then a huge crash, and something sounding like it's rolling, and then another huge smash. We get the flashlight on looking up at the hill, and all we can see is dust and debris falling everywhere. We totally freak the hell out. We don't know what happened, but we decide to go to bed. The next morning when we woke up, we noticed a gigantic old dead tree that had fallen and started rolling down the hill. You could see where it had broken off the hill and rolled away, breaking smaller trees along its path. It was probably about 30 feet tall and big and chunky. It was completely sideways and only stopped by 3 other trees that held it back up the hill. It could have rolled right through our campsite if the other trees hadn't have stopped it. And honestly, it's one of the most disturbing moments of my life, knowing how close we could have been to death had the situations gone any other way. I've never watched shows about aliens or Bigfoot with any intensity, but one weekend the wife and I were stuck inside because of storms, and we watched this show with a dude who supposedly is a survivalist who wasn't a Bigfoot researcher but was intrigued because of his encounters he believed were Bigfoot. They were walking in this area that had these crazy trees all pulled down and twisted up that supposedly couldn't have been done naturally, and they were too big for humans to do this. So anyway, I live in the sticks surrounded by state land that has big hills, swamps and ponds big enough to be almost lakes, and I've never heard anyone in town talk about Bigfoot or anything. I've heard weird screaming and whatnot sounds like what they played on the show, but this time I saw firsthand what they portrayed on the show. So we go moral mushroom hunting on the land the day after we watch the show, and about a mile into these hills we come upon this huge wad of trees all twisted up together. They were woven together like a rope. They weren't little either, bigger than a person could pull down and twist up. They range from 6 to 8 inches at the base of the trunk. We take a few pictures because we thought it was cool and moved on. About 45 minutes later, we come upon another one, and now my wife is getting a little nerved out because the woods are dead silent. We have our son who is 7, so decide it's time to leave. I unstrap my firearm, and as we're walking, a limb of a tree about 2 inches in diameter and 3 foot long comes whizzing past us. I look at her and I point in the direction we came from and said to get moving and take our son. I pull out the firearm and walk quickly backwards, covering their back. I have no idea who or what flung it at us, but we weren't sticking around to find out. The last thing that happened was a loud knocking like someone slamming wood on wood. We finished walking back to the house, not really saying anything to each other until we got home.
One day when I was at Arabic school, my friends and I were pretty much skipping class near the bathrooms. There was a long hallway with a door that had a window in it. I was bored, so I looked down the hallway, and right behind the door was a grey figure. I got spooked and told my friends. They saw it too. But this time, the head was floating above the torso. We went back to class and told everyone, only for the lights to flicker and hear a knock at the door. When the teacher opened the door, there was no one. It was a long hallway too, so you couldn't run very easily without being spotted. After that, the door was shut, and we had to find a different class.
I go hunting in southern Illinois on a property that my family owns. The place is my second home, and I've spent countless hours exploring all around every inch of it. Caught all the fish in the area, hunted every legal game, and spotted the rest. So when I say that I've never had an experience like this, just remember this was my domain that I felt comfortable in any weather at any time with any equipment or lack thereof. 2 deer seasons ago, I had pulled into the farm at about 4:40 in the morning. November, so at least 2 hours till sunlight. I pull my stuff out of the truck and walk into the woods. I have my shotgun and a revolver/knife on my belt, an elbow light clipped to the front of me, and thermos of coffee, and a backpack with a book and a few other things for cleaning my deer should I get lucky. So I walk off the drive and into the woods. The tree stand I'm going to is less than a mile away, but through some dense second-growth forest and down a rather steep hill, across some bottoms, then a lung-burning steep climb up another ridge. I always dread the hike, but it's a good spot, so I go often. I make it down to the bottom, slush through the icy muck and get climbing. With my flashlight clipped to my chest, I keep needing to physically turn my body to throw the beam around to see the trees that I recognize to determine my path. This, of course, always gives the forest a horror movie vibe, even on the best of days. The leaves and underbrush are encased in frost, so every one of my steps comes with a solid crunch no matter how quiet I'm trying to be. This time, though, I noticed there was more noise than usual. Something else was crunching close by too. I walked about a quarter of the way up the hill listening to my company the whole time, seeming to stay the same distance away as I moved. Naturally, I think to myself that I'm going to have a quick hunting day, so I plop my ass down next to a tree. Can't shoot till first light, but I'm hoping if I stay really still, whatever I'm hearing will lounge around until then. So I click my light off, unsling the shotgun and lay on my knees to wait. Except I don't hear anything. Whatever it was must have been spooked by my flashlight, spinning all around as I sat. I still stayed a bit, sipping some coffee to make sure, but gave up after 15 minutes or so of dead silence from the forest. I probably didn't even make 4 steps before the second moving thing starts again. At this point, I'm still not freaked out. I'm facing the way I am and flip the light off again and sidestep behind a tree. Sure enough, I don't hear anything again. 2 minutes of sitting there frustrated before I begin moving again, and my new friend does too. This is when I started to get freaked out, because I worked my way up the hill hoping to turn and look every so often. When I stopped, the sound would go on for just an infinitesimally longer amount of time than my own step, like something seeing me stop and doing its very best to stop before I heard it. This happened no less than 4 times, and by now I'm sweating bullets and freezing cold, because I'm sweating bullets in the middle of winter. I abandoned my thermo near a tree so I could hold my flashlight and my revolver at the same time. The last 100 feet to my stand was done backwards so that I could face the noise and in theory keep it from moving, and I didn't hear anything after that. I got up into my stand, smoked about 5 cigarettes in a row, and gave me a sense of security being up a tree behind camouflage. Still, I only hunted for about an hour of daylight and went back early, and I wasn't moving slowly heading back to the truck, even with the sun shining bright. I haven't told my family about it because they wouldn't believe me, but damn, it was freaky. The sound, and when it decided to happen, felt very human, which it likely was, as poachers and trespassers occasionally wander onto our property. But still, ever since then when I go hunting, I am much better about letting people know where I am going, and for how long, because you never know what can happen when you're out in the woods. I used to work as a fire spotter in a remote tower deep in the woods. On any given day, I would be the only human being for miles. For a couple of weeks, every time it approached sunset, when I'd finished for the day, everything would go eerily quiet, almost like clockwork. It stood out as it wasn't normal. There's usually more noise around that time of day, along with every time I left the cabin to climb down. There was the unnerving feeling of being watched. But, for a while, it was only while climbing down. After that, I started getting the same feeling while on the ground, and it somehow felt much closer. I can only liken it to knowing you're being hunted/stalked. Not overly great when it's a 100-meter walk back to the car with nothing to put between you and whatever else might be out there. This continued on for another week, until I started hearing sorts of chirps and calls. They stood out, and everything was dead quiet. Then one day, walking back across the clearing to the car, there was a long, low, guttural growl somewhere behind me, and I noped out of there as fast as I could, and afterwards started parking the car at the base of the ladder, because screw walking around open with angry sounding, probably bitey things lurking around. A few days later, I was driving back out and spotted a movement on the upside of the road. Looked again as it disappeared into the tree line, large, long and dark. It seemed to hang around until the end of the fire season, as the quietness and eerie feelings were gone at the start of the next. During a camping trip in North Dakota, we had a remarkable encounter with a group of wild bison that wandered into our campsite. The ranger informed us that such encounters were not common in the area. However, what made this particular encounter unique was the sight that greeted us: a deceased coyote dangling from one of the massive male bison's horns. It turns out that coyotes, in their pursuit of an easy meal, sometimes attempt to prey on young bison calves, taking advantage of any perceived vulnerability. In this case, it seems the bison had successfully defended its young from a coyote attack, as evidenced by the coyote's unfortunate demise, impaled on the bison's horn. Despite the unconventional ornament adorning its head, it seemed unperturbed by the coyote carcass hanging from it. It appeared to be carrying on with its usual grazing, and undisturbed by it. While it may have been tempting for some of us to intervene to remove the coyote remains, it could have been a dangerous thing to attempt. I have a friend who was doing a construction job near Glacier National Park. The locals on his crew were Native American, and they would have fun joshing my friend by telling him stories and the lore of the local area. One night, after a few beers, he calls them out about one story in particular, and so they took him out and showed him. There's a path accessible only by horseback or on foot, as it winds through dense forests and crosses a few streams that lead to a clearing. In this clearing are 3 trees, lined up side by side, each tree stretched up between 25 to 30 feet tall. What made my friend nope out of there is at the top of the trees were roots, not branches. A full network of roots, like someone or something had pulled them straight from the ground, flipped them around and replanted them in the earth. I have no evidence of this story, just that he was very genuine when he recounted it. He believed what he was telling me, which makes me more inclined to believe that what he saw was true. A few years ago, me and 3 friends went to a cross-country summer camp that took place at a fancy private boarding school. I was 16 at the time, and my 3 friends were 17. We were in the same dorm room. Every 2 rooms were connected by a bathroom, so every 8 shared a bathroom. The boys were on the ground floor, and the girls, us, were upstairs. One day after our morning run, me and one of my friends, Emma, went back to our dorm. The other 2 stayed out, and so did the 4 girls in the room next to us. I know for a fact because they were all going to play soccer together, and they left their side of the bathroom door open, so I could see no one was in there. Me and Emma got changed and then sat on our beds and talked for about an hour. We then started laughing about something, and a few seconds in, I heard a deep man's voice laughing with us.
I immediately stopped laughing and so did Emma. We looked at each other silently for about a minute, and I felt like I was frozen. Then I said to get lunch, or something like that, and we grabbed our stuff and left. I thought about it but was too scared to look in the closet as we left. We told my coach, he was a counsellor too, and then when we got back in, one of the women's counsellors helped us look around, but we didn't find anything. Nothing appeared to have been moved or stolen. Here's what I think happened. Our room was right next to the emergency staircase. The boys weren't allowed upstairs, so the counsellors guarded the main staircase, but not the emergency ones. We also didn't lock our doors since we were constantly going in and out. I think one or two of the boys came back from their run because everyone else thought it would be funny to sneak into the girls' room. They went up to the emergency stairs since there was no counsellors around, and went into the first room they saw, which would have been ours. They probably hid in the closet and watched us change before frightening us. Creepy in several respects, to be honest. The following are a collection of stories that happened to me at a popular national park, and they are all true. The first story starts with me trekking into the desert on my own. To give you some context, I'm in my mid-20s, and I started to camp and hike alone quite a bit, and when I hiked, I would seek as remote a location as possible. I'm a 5'5" petite female, and honestly made some pretty dumb decisions like wearing headphones while wandering in terrain alone, but I had a lot of fun and have since gotten smarter about handling myself in the wilderness. I had hopped into my car and headed to the desert, as I so often do, and picked a spot where to park, where there were no cars or tourists or people of any sort, grabbed my pack and my headphones and excitedly hopped out of the car to go off and explore and climb some rocks in the distance. I'm feeling good until I get not even a mile out and I see this huge bullet in the dirt. My dad, who is law enforcement and was a National Guard later, said the way I described it by size that it had to be from a grounded gun, and there was no way someone would just be walking through the desert with this weapon. Something about it unsettled me, and I didn't know if I should bring it to the ranger or what. I felt weird taking it with me, so I ended up just awkwardly burying it and moving on. For whatever reason, it put me intensely on edge. I felt jumpy and jarred, and was having none of the usual relaxation I have on my treks. A few steps later, I heard the weirdest noise I've heard in my life. It was a high-pitched buzzing/electrical noise that just encompassed the space around me. Now, if you know the desert, you know the acoustics can sometimes get a bit weird since noise bounces off rocks. But this was akin to nothing I've heard, and my instinctual reaction was sheer panic. I fumble for my phone and surprisingly have reception, so I call my then boyfriend and he tells me it's probably nothing and that I should enjoy myself. I take a few more steps and the noise instantly starts again, louder, and my body is screaming to hightail it back to my car, which I do. I'm stumbling over myself. I'm back on the phone with my boyfriend, feeling like I'm being chased. I make it back and feel a rush of relief as I get to my car. I know this may sound anticlimactic, but the amount of fear I felt in that moment is something I've never felt before or since. It felt like a warning of sorts to stay the hell away. I strongly believe in intuition, so I trusted my gut that it was nothing good. I'm hoping someone has experienced something similar to this and has insight, because I'm yet to find out any useful information. My second story takes place at the same national park. One thing I love about it is there's a fairly decent chance you'll see weird stuff in the sky at night. I attribute it to the fact that there is a military test pilot base fairly close, but what you see is some really strange phenomena. This was the most interesting one I've seen. The openness of the desert makes it easy to see the beautiful night sky above you. One particular night, I looked up and see some objects flying high and off in the distance. If I remember correctly, one was white and one was red. They moved in a strange formation, and at a pace too fast for any aerial physics I know of. I can't imagine the G-force involved, or how we could have the technology that allows for speed that fast. I'm in awe watching this for a while, them zipping around, and to make things even more baffling,
They moved in diagonal lines at certain points, like literally making acute angle turns on a hairpin. They would also sometimes pause and suspend, then zip around more. The final spectacular was when I start to see them fly towards each other and seemingly merge into one object. It then changed color. Now this singular object shines a little brighter and slowly fades out to nothing. It was one of the most bizarre and amazing things I've ever seen. I'm guessing it's military related, so either they have some crazy aerial technology, or they're in cahoots with the extraterrestrials. One of my best buds from college was a geologist major that ended up becoming a ranger in southeast US. Haven't spoken in years, as is the case with age, but I remember about 8 or 9 years back, he was telling me about an old married couple that he had recently helped out. He had seen them coming to the park several days in a row and found out where they were visiting us from, and that they had gotten engaged there decades prior. They had been searching for a spot they'd taken pics of where he popped the question, but were having trouble. After looking at the pics and figuring out roughly where they were trying to get to, he escorted them in his vehicle, then hiked with them to where he thought it would be. They found it, and he left and went back to his station at the entrance. He said he got a weird feeling once he got back, and felt like he needed to wait to see them whenever they left. Well, once it came to lock up for the night, he still hadn't seen them, so he reported it, left his assistant to wait at the shack at the entrance, and went back to where he left them. He found both of them lying down, spooning along the bank of a river. Neither were alive. He called the cops, went through the 9 yards, and went home. The police were able to disclose to him their identities. Later he learned that the wife was terminally ill with cancer, and they had both committed suicide by ingesting some sort of chemical/pill combination medley. They just chose to do it where they had gotten engaged at. My buddy wasn't torn up about it. He was obviously sad for them dying, but said that he thought they hadn't asked for his help earlier because they didn't want to think anyone had helped kill them. About 17 years ago, my cross-country team and I had the opportunity to visit Yosemite National Park. It was an exciting adventure, and we set up camp in a populated area. To no one's surprise, the sleeping arrangements turned out to be separate tents for girls and boys. My thoughtful grandma had gotten me a small tent of my own, very luckily. Sleeping has never come easy to me when I was younger. Throughout our week-long stay, several interesting incidents occurred. One evening, a bear strolled by my tent, which was quite a memorable encounter, and on another occasion I heard a distinct sound of a woman screaming, and it startled both me and the girls in the neighboring tent. However, there was one peculiar night that stands out in my memory. I heard splashing and rustling noises coming from the nearby lake, leading me to assume it was just another bear or some other animal. Out of curiosity, I decided to investigate, although I now realize it might not have been the safest idea. Armed with my flashlight, I pointed it in the direction of the sounds and caught a glimpse of what appeared to be a person, but not quite. This figure was small in stature and lacked any clothing. It moved swiftly, darting behind the trees before disappearing from sight. Feeling unsettled, I promptly retreated to the safety of my tent, thankful I didn't encounter anything else like that for the remainder of our trip. In Maine in springtime, I was staying on a remote farm in a converted barn. Of course it was at night, and I was going out to my van through a tall grass field to get my smokes, about 100 yards away. I didn't bring my headlamp because the moon was out, and on my way back there was a tree stump in the trail that I didn't notice before. I stopped, mystified, trying to catch its outline. It stood on 2 legs. I nearly crapped myself. It was about 3 to 4 feet tall and hobbled over to me, like it had a limp. I ran into the barn and yelled at my friend to come out, but she was as pale as a ghost, and she said to never talk about it again with her. Earlier that day, you see, we'd been exploring the woods nearby and came upon a weird stone circle in the woods. Wasn't much, but the rocks were partially buried and overgrown, like with weeds, as if they'd been there for a long time. Another weird note is that this thing, whatever it was, walked exactly like the lady who owned the land. She had polio as a child and walked with a limp. It was really weird. No idea what it was, and perhaps I don't want to know.
I was about 8, and it was the middle of summer. My parents had to work, but they couldn't leave us alone at home. So they put us in this daycare. The daycare, which I can't remember the name of, had been converted from one wing of an old hospital, and the rest was closed off. They were still doing renovations on our side of the building, and the 3rd floor was supposed to be off limits. Of course, when something is off limits, kids start making up theories about why that is. There were rumors, and the place was haunted. A few of the older kids even claimed they'd seen some stuff. One kid even bragged that he'd snuck up to the 3rd floor and saw something in one of the bathrooms. We pressed him on it, and he said he heard someone call him from the bathroom, and when he went to investigate, it was an empty room. But he looked down the drain into one of the sinks, and a peanut popped out and started talking. At the time it sounded stupid, but enough of the younger kids were creeped out, and somehow that made me get the creeps. Well, over the next few weeks, all the kids would circulate these stories and pester the caretaker to take us upstairs to see what was there. Eventually, the renovations got to a point where it was safe to go up, though the caretaker still kept us on the 1st and 2nd floors to keep track of us. And the pestering reached new heights. They relented one day and promised to take us up after lunch. So everyone starts walking upstairs, and I'm at the back of the group with one of the caretakers, while the other 2 caretakers led the group. We get to the top of the stairs and it's pretty boring. White walls, a few doors missing, wood frames, single fan at the end of the hall that was turned on. The caretaker I was with seems confused and walks over to the fan and turns it off and unplugs it. The rest of the group began walking towards the peanut bathroom, and when I turned to start making my way there, I thought I saw someone standing in an empty room I was near. I barely caught it from the corner of my eye and snapped my attention to the room. Startled, but no one was there. After the past few weeks hearing how the place was haunted, I was thoroughly scared and ready to go back downstairs. The kids got to the bathroom and I hadn't even gotten to it myself when they started screaming and running back out. I turned around and bolted back downstairs and noticed that the fan was plugged in and turned on again. Now I have to reiterate how everyone was in front of me except for one caretaker who was standing next to me and couldn't have been the one to plug it back in, as it was at the other end of the hall. That was it for me, and I asked her to take me back downstairs. The rest of the kids had explored a little bit more, but came down pretty soon after. Not the scariest thing, but the 3rd floor of that place cemented my belief in the paranormal. There were some smaller incidences during the week leading up to the 3rd floor investigations. One of the rooms at the daycare was filled with large foam shapes that kids like to climb around on and make forts out of. Most of these were light enough to carry, but a few pieces were too big for anyone but the adults to move around without struggling. I remember one piece in particular was just a large rectangle. The kids were playing in that room, then decided to move to another room that had some dolls and action figures. We had one caretaker lead us there while the other stayed behind. About halfway down the hall, I hear a loud slap sound which made me jump out my skin. I was at the back of the group, and awkward, and tended to just follow the other kids. I whipped around to see that large rectangular piece sitting about a foot behind me. No one was close enough to have dragged it there, and even if they had, I would have heard them dragging it behind me. As the heaviest piece, no one could have brought it, and no one should have been able to hide in the time it took me to turn around. The other caretaker poked her head around the room with a confused look and collected the foam rectangle. The last thing I remember clearly about the place was when we were all gathered on the first floor. I'd left something on the second and asked to go up and get it. We only had one caretaker with us at the time, and she couldn't escort me up as all the other kids needed to be kept track of, so she had one of the older kids follow me up for safety. We got to the room and the light was out, but the thing I'd left was pretty close to the door, so I grabbed it. Immediately the older kid I was with screamed and began running downstairs. I looked up and saw what looked like a figure in the corner of the room and bolted. When I got downstairs, the kid was doubled over laughing and teasing me for being afraid of a coat rack. I was mad, but went on with my day. Near the end of the day, we were back on the second floor playing while waiting for parents to show up. My dad came to get me and I went back into the room to collect my things. The light was on, and there was no coat rack in the corner.
This is a quick story from when I was growing up in northern Kentucky in the 90s. I would have been around 10. I'm in my 30s now, but I vividly remember this happening and still think about it frequently. My best friend lived with his grandparents for a bit on several acres of land in Walton, Kentucky, and I spent almost every weekend there. They never really did much with the land. It remained relatively cleared, but there were no farms or structures on it. They had a horse stable near the house, but that was it. My friend had received a go-kart for his birthday, so we were out driving it around on the open land. It was just the two of us, and we were having a blast riding this thing around. It was getting close to dusk, and we knew we were both going to have to pack it up pretty soon. We came to a stop, and the engine cut out, and almost at the same time, both of us had this strange sensation come over us. We felt like we were both being watched by something. It's weird how our lizard brains can still even process something like this, but we both agreed there was a weird, overbearing feeling. We hadn't heard his grandpa's truck, and we were too far away to be seen from the house, so we began looking around. We were in an open field in the middle of their land, and it was surrounded by trees and tall brush, but something caught my eye first, and I got my friend to look in the same direction. In that brush, we could see a long, almost black-shaped thing sitting very still. I know at this point in the story, most of you are thinking Bigfoot, and I can say I remember things being dead silent. Even now I sometimes wonder if it was something else we saw, but all I remember is thinking it was a giant black wolf, about 200 feet away from us, and it was sitting perfectly still. But to me it looked furry. I couldn't make out any other personal features like eyes or ears, but I swear this thing was making us feel watched. It's like when you see a cat getting ready to pounce. That was what it felt like we were looking at. We were both getting really spooked by this point. The sun was getting low behind the tree line, and one of us was going to have to jump out and start the engine back up. We were whispering about what it was that we were watching. Honestly, I forgot which one of us jumped out and started the car back up, but when we looked back at the black shape, it was gone. The go-kart didn't have lights, so we drove as fast as we could back to his grandparents' house, and we told them what we saw. His grandparents said we probably saw a coyote or maybe a boar, but the shape was long and low, and a coyote doesn't sit well in my head with what I saw, not to mention pitch black and furry. Every few years I think about this story, and I've read there are no more wolves in Kentucky. I think I've convinced myself it was a coyote. My dad is a forestry technician, and this happened to one of his co-workers. They were up doing some sort of job in the very most northerly part of Ontario. Anyway, it was in the middle of the night, and she was half asleep and vaguely heard something outside her tent. Then she felt something push against her tent, and the zipper slowly opened. She opened her eyes and saw the head of a polar bear in her tent. Polar bears are far from the cuddly toys you see, and they are known to be super aggressive and will hunt and eat people. She laid there paralyzed with fear, thinking that was the end, and then slowly, the bear retracted its head and left. One evening in the dark heart of the forest on my family's land, we gathered around a crackling fire, enjoying the tranquility of the wilderness, when suddenly the stillness was shattered by a piercing, blood-curdling noise that echoed through the trees. Compelled by curiosity and concern, we followed the eerie sound towards the bank of the nearby river. Illuminating the scene with our flashlights, a heart-wrenching sight unfolded before our eyes. A deer trapped in the treacherous sand and mud found itself at the mercy of a pack of hungry wolves, tearing it to shreds. Witnessing the scene was a mix of emotions, sadness, compassion for the suffering animal, and the awe and raw power of the instinctual predator. The experience left me with a profound sense of both fragility and resilience of life in the wilderness, and a reminder that the delicate balance exists in nature. I was walking with a friend, and we liked exploring hiking trails and stuff, and came across a small grassy field in the middle of the woods. Nothing too special about it, but the area was surreal, as it felt very out of place. We thought maybe it was an area cut down by loggers or something, but just appeared to be too natural for that. We sat down and took the area in, sun shining with shades from the trees surrounding the area, and it felt like something from a Zelda game in the woods. Weeks later, we were going to shoot a video for a school project, and thought, let's shoot it back at that spot. We explored the whole area again to find nothing but woods, and never found that random field again, and tried years later to no avail. I'm not a big believer in the supernatural, but it makes me scratch my head to this day.
I was around 12. I don't remember the date. I've always been a big childish person, partly because of a car accident when I entered medium school, and felt like it stopped my growth mentally. I barely had any friends because I was going through the weird looks/bullying, and the only ones that were okay to hang out with me were younger people or of the same mindset. Every year my parents would send me to a summer camp called Lost in the Mountains, where there were basically mountain-like activities, hiking, exploring forests, etc. I live in France. I don't know how summer camps work everywhere else, but here it's basically an age classification, with there being 3 groups. The blue ones, younger, yellow medium, and green elder. I was supposed to go into the yellow group, the medium one, because I was still too young, but for some reason I got taken to the green one, composed of people that were 16 or 17, so a lot older than me. And everyone hated me for being so young and childish. The day that I remember was the last day. The instructors that were keeping an eye on us brought us to the deep spot of the forest to have a picnic, and after that they looked at us and asked who wanted to play hide and seek. Everyone was probably too old for that, but they still set things up, to which most refused to even hide. I was a kid. Of course I was excited when they just started counting, and I ran as fast as I could to a place super far they wouldn't find me. There was a smallish river. I jumped over it, and after some steps I feel a hand catching my hair very violently. I tried to turn, but the hand just slipped to my neck and caught it really tight. I was terrified and tried to fight back and resist, but the hand that was restraining me was that of a grown man with lots of strength. I began screaming at the top of my lungs. I've never screamed so loudly, but seemingly no one ever heard me, and the guy started talking while dragging me into the forest. He was completely mad and kept repeating, "You'll see. I hurt you so much you'll cry and scream even more." I remember him talking about harming me and violating me. I was 13 and I was so terrified. I've never lived any physical abuse, no hitting, nothing was more than words, and he dragged me further into the forest and I kept screaming and hitting, until at some point I found a way to bite his hand with all the strength of my jaw. He screamed back from pain and shouted that I was crazy. It's when he got it hurt enough that his arm retracted and I escaped and turned back and made the sprint of my life. I think the guy lost interest or something because he didn't chase after me. I jumped back over the river and found the only friend I'd made during camp. I kept running though. I still wasn't sure if she saw the thing that happened or if she ignored it. I went to the monitors but felt too terrified to do anything or even tell them. So I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if it was someone from the camp or a total stranger. I didn't even see his skin or the clothes he was wearing, nothing. I was just too afraid. The same night I called my parents, but they couldn't come to get me right away. I had to go back home in the bus like everyone else. What terrified me the most was that the guy could be one of the people in the same group as me. He could have just hit me in my sleep and dragged me somewhere. I still don't know, and I never want to know. All that I know is that I was terrified for the remainder of my stay there, knowing that me as a 13-year-old girl could have been in very real danger because someone had targeted me, whether they be part of the group or not, and I felt extremely vulnerable and scared for the rest of my time there. As you can imagine, I was overjoyed when it was over, and never wished to return to camp again.
Me and my dad went hunting a year or so ago, and we found this enormous pile of bones. The scary thing was we found a human skull, but the rest of the bones were from farm animals and other forest creatures. It was at this point we decided it'd be best to get the authorities involved, but we also walked further to see if there was more we could uncover. I wish we'd have just gotten the hell out of there, because we found several large holes that were recently dug and filled back in again. Me and my dad never went hunting there again because neither of us could stomach it, and never followed up to find out what it was the authorities uncovered. I shiver to think about it and don't want to know. I worked for a few months as a park ranger with the Florida Forest Service at my local state forest. The creepiest thing I saw was a poor young man who had hung himself on my second week in the job. The unexplainable, though, are obviously not as cut and dry. We have children's clothes neatly folded and left on the trails, pairs of shoes in the middle of our dense burn blocks, and just a general sense of eeriness. My first few weeks on the job, I was easily spooked, but after I got into my groove of spending hours alone in the woods, it took a far bit more to shake me. When the forest goes silent, it's best to pack up and move along. Growing up, I lived right in front of a cattle field that wasn't used for half the year. The owner gave me and my brother permission to fish and walk around the woods in the fields when his cattle weren't there. We often took advantage of it over the summer breaks. My older brother had started skateboarding one year, and our stepmom hated it, so we'd go into the woods to keep her from knowing. We found a really run-down small house in the middle of it, along with concrete slabs nearby. The concrete wasn't suitable for purpose due to the steep slants seeping into the dirt, so naturally the house was where he practiced. We had videos of pics of him skateboarding in this building within the property lines. He also had barbed wire fencing around the property, so he knew we were within its limits. One day in passing, my brother mentioned doing work to it to stabilize it so that we could use it for skateboarding, and the owner of the land looked utterly confused, saying he's brailed the cornfield and walked the woods 1,000,000 times and that there was no building whatsoever. He confirmed the concrete, but not the small shed thing about 5 yards away. He even said at one point that when he purchased it there was one, but he tore it down because it was in the way of baling. He eventually said that maybe it was just us using the docks by the pond, but being in the heat all summer made us imagine the building. But there's no way we imagined the whole thing, and what made it worse was that we moved before we got to go back next summer to see if it was still there.
I went to a high school that was built years ago, maybe 200 to 300. Me and my friend noticed these hatches that were around 6 feet off the floor next to the toilets. For context, the school was based around a quad, so there was a toilet down some stairs at each corner of the quad. Obviously we had to check these hatches out, so we did during a drama lesson that we snuck out of. We got in there, and there was a corridor under the actual corridor, which is only about 4 to 5 feet tall, so we had to crawl through. The corridors connected all the toilets and their vents at the top of the walls, and there was a skirting board level in the classroom, so we could watch lessons, which was cool. There were tons of pipes and electrical wires and other non-interesting stuff like you'd expect, apart from in one corner of the quad. The hatch for this one was locked from the inside, looked like the pipes had gone back to the wall or stopped, so the walls were bare concrete slabs rather than bricks, which was odd. There was a small gap at the bottom of the wall that I could only just fit through. It was a struggle crawling under, as we only had our mobiles and for torches, and I'm not the smallest of people. When we got through, it felt so much colder in this opening than in the other corridors. The space was far spacious as we could stand up, and also the lights from our torches didn't light up at the opposite side of the room. When we shone them, we almost made it seem like our torches weren't even on. The room smelled so bad, and we saw what looked like a decomposed cat, which was now mostly just bone and fur, next to the wall closest to us. More freaky stuff there was the stone arch above the cat. There was some red writing that wasn't in blood but was pretty creepy. It was a few years ago, but I vaguely remember it saying something along the lines of, "If you're found here, the school will expel you, but Lucifer will do much worse." There were a few scratches on the walls and some symbols that we thought were letters, but we couldn't make them out. We took some pictures and got the hell out of there. Because we were crapping bricks at this point, it was a fairly prestigious school, so expulsion was probably the scariest thing that could happen to us. This was 4 years ago now. Safe to say me and my friend never opted to return.
I am a wilderness survival instructor and security contractor. A few days ago, a student of mine and good friend who I had taken out into the woods before told me his dad just got 150 acres of land in a secluded mountainous part of my state. It had a large amount of forest on it that hadn't been explored yet, as his dad was only building something for his horses that took up about 100 yards of the property, and his horses were free to roam at the moment. He said his dad got an insane deal on the property. My friend is now a dad of 3, and I knew he didn't get out into the woods that often. So I agreed to go with him, because it seemed really fun, and I can imagine he needs a getaway every now and then. We were both indigenous, into cars, into wilderness survival, and all sorts of stuff, so we never run out of anything to talk about in the woods. His dad, however, did express to us that he didn't want anyone exploring the woods, unless they had a gun. He said it was because he saw coyotes. Now, we're all indigenous here, we're all raised in the same state. Coyotes don't actually attack people. My friend, called RC, also told me a while back, when we were first at the property, that he saw movement in the tree lines that was roughly human-sized and shaped, but couldn't really tell since his eyesight wasn't superb. I bought my AR and a small flint napping kit just for the fun of it, and we set off onto the property. We explored a lot of the rolling fields, creeks, and multiple natural springs and ponds. Everything felt normal. It was a beautiful landscape. Eventually, we decided to get to the forested part of the property, as it hadn't been explored yet. As soon as we entered the tree line, the entire mood shifted. The forest had an ambience of its own, very similar to the woods in the movie The Ritual. The woods were grey and dead silent, save for the occasional creaking of tall, tired cedar trees. There was a very small stream running through the center of it with sand that was black. It felt like we were surrounded, watching from all sides. It didn't take long before a very putrid stench hit our nostrils. It was the odor of rotting flesh. We decided to follow the smell and found the remains of 3 to 4 cows. We examined the exposed skulls and couldn't find any bullet holes. It didn't appear to me that these cows had been put down. Something killed them though, and their bones were spread over 30 yards. There were large indentations in the dirt all around them, since they were very vague in their shape. We decided to press on into the woods. Now, we were accompanied only by silence, the putrid odor of death, and the sound of our own heartbeats. We kept stopping at the stream, as I noticed several different types of tracks, large coyote tracks, and something else that was large but intentionally avoided the sand, it seemed. We pressed on into the woods until we started to find trees that had been bent over and pinned behind other trees while they were still alive. Something that could never, ever happen naturally. We hiked on and found what I can only describe as a tool made of bone lying on the ground. It was extremely crude, but looked like some kind of scooping tool or knife. It was disturbing because although it looked primitive, it looked way more primitive than a person could make, but an intentionally shaped tool nonetheless. We hiked on until we found a clearing with a pond that had a more large oval track surrounding it. On the other side of the pond we found a very strange little tree structure. It was an A-frame. It had rocks placed up against it. However, it wasn't that sturdy, and the rocks were very peculiarly placed. We found no signs of any campfires around it. We found no trash camping. This isn't exactly a place you could hike to from a house. I photographed and made a video of the little hut thing. It was getting dark, so we decided we should head back. I had a flashlight on my AR, but didn't want to rely on that in the dark with something that kills cows and could make tools out of their bones somewhere behind us. We made our way out of the forest and back to where the trucks were parked just in time before it got too dark to see. As we were leaving, we saw something on top of one of the hills that we couldn't identify, but didn't stick around to find out what it was. It's worth mentioning that the previous owner began construction on something of the property, abruptly halted construction and left. I spent a summer in Wyoming, going to BLM land and other remote locations collecting data on bats and herpetofauna. I heard a lot of weird noises like mountain lions screaming, deers snorting, and what sounded like owls fighting. I woke up one morning to find 2 bull moose sleeping 20 yards behind my tent. All of this was part of my job, until one night a truck was driving towards us when we were on a BLM square in the southwestern part of the state. The truck was going over land, no roads, and was slowly driving at us. It stopped about 100 yards away, turned off the lights, and we could see a person get out. They walked a full circle around us at around 100 yards, got back in the truck, and turned around. This was after dark, and this shadowy figure did a complete circle around us. You could hear them walking through the sagebrush, and I'm sure they could hear us talking. We packed up after that, and drove to a hotel an hour away. I called the office, and told them I was taking a gun when we went back out. Didn't like having the bear mace as our only defense. By the way, BLM stands for Bureau of Land Management. Rock Island is a state park located at the tip of Door County, Wisconsin on Lake Michigan. It's a difficult place to get to. To get to Rock Island, you have to take a car ferry from Ellison Bay to Washington Island and drive across Washington Island to Jackson Harbor, then take a pedestrian-only ferry to Rock Island, as there are no vehicles or bikes allowed. Even though the island is relatively small, at about 975 acres, it has a very rich and interesting history. In the early 1600s, it was inhabited by a tribe of Potawatomi Native Americans, as well as a small fishing village of European settlers. The two groups did not trust each other, and did have a few bad encounters that almost led to violence, but for the most part, they lived peacefully together on the island. By the year 1640, the Potawatomi had migrated to other parts of Wisconsin. Shortly after they'd left, some settlers from the fishing village reported seeing a new group of people on the island. They seemed to be more white settlers, but they wore strange clothes and kept to themselves. No one from the fishing village was able to talk to one of these new settlers or even find where they were living. It was around that time that strange things began to occur on the island. Several animals, it was not mentioned what they were, maybe pigs or chickens that were kept by the settlers, were found slaughtered in the village and seemed to have been used to mark in blood some of the buildings on the village. On a different night, a building used for preserving meat burnt down. The villagers felt like these things must have been done by the new people on the island, and they intended to find them. But after a thorough search of the island, included the wooded inland area, they never found a single person. These strange occurrences seemed to stop soon after the search, and none of the other settlers were ever seen again. In 1836, the Potawatomi Lighthouse was built on the northern part of the island. After construction was finished, the lighthouse was inspected, and it was reported to be that the material of the lighthouse and dwelling were made of the best quality, and it was reported that the work was done very well. David E. Corbin was appointed the first keeper of the light on December 19th, 1837. Only 3 years later, in 1840, despite the apparent quality of construction of the lighthouse, he started to complain that plaster began falling off the building and some sort of liquid would ooze through the cracks, leaving the house constantly damp. Corbin was completely alone most of the time at the lighthouse, and some have said that when visiting him, he would stare at certain parts of the wall and spoke vaguely to the other visitors. In 1845, after 8 years of relative solitude at the lighthouse, an inspector visited the lighthouse keeper and determined that while Corbin was fulfilling his duties, he was acting strangely. The official report stated that the inspector ordered Corbin to take a 25-day leave of absence to find a wife to live with him at the lighthouse. However, something that the inspector noticed was Corbin's mental state. He thought that by years of solitude, it would be best that he spent some time away from the island. In 1852, Corbin reportedly fell ill and died that December in the lighthouse. He was buried in a small cemetery just south of the lighthouse. The next lighthouse keeper also reported the surprising quick deterioration of the lighthouse. Some friends that he had visit say that he would talk of seeing strange things in the lighthouse at night, but he would never elaborate on what. In 1858, after only 22 years of service, the original lighthouse was torn down and a new one was built. From that point on, the lighthouse keepers were required to have an assistant keeper or a family with them at the lighthouse. No strange occurrences were further reported in the lighthouse logbook outside of some strong storms and occasional shipwrecks, except on January 20th, 1876. The keeper at the time, named Betts, reported that he saw 2 men attempting to row to the mainland from Washington Island. He wrote that a terrible storm came up shortly after they departed, and they never made it to their destination. Over 3 months later, on May 3rd, 1876, Bett wrote, 2 men who were lost in January have been seen several times, once from Caney Lighthouse and once from Jacksonport. The men were allegedly frozen stiff and sitting upright in the boat among a mass of ice. At last account, they were still adrift. There's not much hope they will be found and buried. By 1900, most of the island's inhabitants left for better fishing areas on Lake Michigan. In 1910, a successful business owner and inventor, Chester Thordarson, purchased all of the island except for the land that the lighthouse occupied in the north. He used the island as a private summer retreat for his business in Chicago. Thordarson is responsible for the unique and mystifying buildings and structures that are still on the island today. On the south end of the island, he built a giant stone hall that has a boathouse on the lower level. A stone water tower was built on the east side of the island, and an imposing wooden gate was constructed on the west end of the island. The Great Hall was used to store his immense book collection. He had over 11,000 books, and it was rumored that he possessed some very rare books in the occult in his collection. He died of heart failure on January 6, 1945, though some have speculated that he saw something that actually scared him to death. After his death, multiple churches and universities were interested in his collection, but he had willed it to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, providing that they had to purchase it for $300,000, which they did. Some of this history was hard to find on the internet, but there are a few binders in the Great Hall that has a lot of this documented. His personal archive and papers are housed in the archive section of the State Historical Society of Wisconsin. This history was important to provide, to give context for the experience I had on the island. In August of 2021, I took my first and last trip to Rock Island. After taking 2 ferry rides, I arrived on the island at 2 p.m. I had booked a remote campsite, which is called E, in the backpacking site that's just over a little of a mile away from the dock. I took my time on the hike, out on the site to enjoy the scenery, and took a few breaks just due to how heavy my pack was. It was definitely packed more for camping than hiking. I got to my site, set up my tent, got everything situated, and started gathering sticks and driftwood from the beach so that I could start a fire. On my 3rd trip back from the beach, before I got back to my site, I heard a single, high-pitched squeal noise coming from the forest. It didn't sound close, but it was such an unusual sound that I stopped in my tracks and waited for a good 30 seconds, waiting to see if it would happen again. It didn't, so I continued back to my site. When I got back, I began working on getting a fire started. The remote camping site on Rock Island are pretty well spaced out, so sites C, D, and E are grouped together, but there's probably 100 yards between each. There's not a real trail connecting the 3 sites directly, but enough people have walked along the ridge between the 3 sites that there's an obvious path. As I was setting some sticks up in my fire ring, something caught my eye. I looked up, and fairly far away, it looked like it may have been at site D or a little further, was a person running in my direction. My first thought was, well, that's odd, because like I said, it's not really a very traily trail. Then in my mind, there must have been something wrong, like the person needed help. As they grew closer, and it looked like maybe they were a woman in loose grey clothes, perhaps a hoodie, it was still too far away for me to tell. I quickly stood up from the crouching position I was in, and just as I did, I heard a high-pitched squeal noise. It was behind me and it was much closer. This startled me quite a bit, so I turned around to look behind me. I scanned the trees for a few seconds but didn't see or hear a thing. I turned back around because I knew the running person must be getting close, but now they were gone. I stood there, scanned the trees but did not see them anywhere. I was so confused, I was kind of frozen for a few moments. It was all very strange, but I was able to reason it out of my head that I was just a fellow camper from Site C or D, and that maybe they were running to the pit toilet that was a few 100 yards west of the sites. I tried to forget about it all, but it was really just bothering me. I did not like whatever that squeal noise was, and it just felt strange. With some effort, I decided to let it go and started my fire. I had a quick meal and a couple of adult beverages, then decided to take a little walk. I hadn't seen Site C or D yet, so I thought I would check those out to see if I had any neighbors camping nearby. But Site D was empty. I did see the path that led from the site to the main trail and the pit toilet, so that made me feel a little less uneasy about the runner. I figured it was maybe someone from Site C that took a strange way to get to the main trail by going through Site D. It didn't make a ton of sense because I probably still should have seen them, but it made me feel better. I continued on to Site C and saw there was a tent set up. I really didn't want to bother anyone, but I thought I would just go over with the excuse that I would introduce myself as a camping neighbor from Site E and see if anyone looked like they might have been the person running earlier. I came upon the site and there was a couple sitting at the picnic table. Neither of them looked like they would have been the person I saw running. I introduced myself and they introduced themselves. They were probably in their mid-30s, were very nice and both seemed pretty drunk, but a quiet drunk. I didn't ask about the runner or the squealing noises because I thought it might be weird. I wished them all a good night and walked back to my tent. When I got back, I had a cigar and a few more drinks. It got dark, and it started as a perfect night. The sky was clear, and I was staring up looking at millions of stars. I felt better about everything from earlier and felt stupid about the whole thing and decided to get some sleep. It was a long day, so I fell asleep almost immediately. But around 2:30 a.m., I was awoken by a huge boom of thunder. It started downpouring. The wind picked up and the temperature dropped considerably. I love camping in the rain, but I do not like camping in a lightning storm. A pretty big storm came through, and I was starting to worry. The wind was ripping around my tent, and the ground was shaking from the thunder and lightning. I did not feel good about being out there in the tent, and felt very exposed. The storm lasted for about an hour before it became just a light, steady drizzle. I was about to start falling back asleep when I heard the squeal noise again. I opened my eyes up wide in the dark and just lay there silent. There was another loud squeal noise and it was pretty close. I knew there was no real dangerous animals on Rock Island. There were deer and porcupines, but nothing like bears or wolves. Knowing that still didn't make me feel any better though. There was just something about the squeal that I didn't like. I say squeal because it's the best way I can describe it. It sounded to me like a pig squeal. Honestly don't know that much about pig noises, but that's what I thought of when I heard it. An injured or angry pig squeal. I continued to lay in my tent when I started to hear footsteps outside of it. It was still raining, so the sounds were a little buried in the sound of rain, but it definitely sounded like a somewhat large animal or human walking around. I sat up in my tent and took a knife I had out just to feel better. In my head, I just kept saying, "You know, it's just an animal, it's fine. There's nothing here that can hurt you." I listened as the footsteps began retreating from my tent, and I just sat there, still holding the knife for maybe 10 minutes without hearing anything. That's when I began thinking to myself, it's fine. It was just an animal, you're being silly. And you need to get some sleep. I was just about to lay back down when there was a very loud squeal, and it was right outside my tent. It felt like my heart just stopped, and a shiver went down my spine. My heart was beating so hard my entire body was pulsing, and I felt it in my ears. It took everything in me, but I forced a "get out of here" from my mouth. Not shouting, but as stern and mean-sounding as I could in that moment. I didn't hear any more squeals or footsteps that night, but I also didn't sleep. I just sat there in my tent for maybe an hour before I lay down. Eventually the rain stopped, and I kept laying there until the sun came up. All that time reassuring myself that I was being stupid. It was just an animal. It was probably 7 a.m. before I decided I had to get out of my tent to relieve myself, and as soon as I stepped outside, I saw that my picnic table had been turned over and was upside down. When I saw this, I was surprisingly calm and thought, okay, this is enough, I'm leaving the island today. I checked my surroundings, and nothing else seemed out of place. I eventually reasoned with myself that the wind had blown the table over during the storm. It still seemed a little strange because the table was pretty heavy, and I felt like I would have heard the table flipping over, but that might have made sense. I made some cold instant coffee, had a bite to eat and started to feel better about the whole thing, and decided to go for a hike. I admit I get scared easily when I'm camping by myself in the woods. Maybe that's natural. After I had some coffee and food, the sun came out, and I realized I hadn't heard or seen anything really that couldn't be explained away. The reason I came to the island in the first place was the 7-mile Thordarson Loop trail that had a lot of interesting things to see, and I was excited to start the hike. I packed a few things in my backpack and started off. Fairly close to my site is the water tower. I have no idea how it originally worked or why it had to be a tower, but it's an impressive building with a fireplace that looks like someone had recently had a fire in it. A little further down the trail was a cemetery, where 2 sisters and a few others are buried. It's believed that there are still more buried here in unmarked graves. These likely are some of the settlers from the old fishing village. The island has 3 cemeteries. There is one by the beach. That's where Chester Thordarson is buried. There's one on the eastern part of the island, where the two sisters are buried, and there's one on the northern part of the island, where the original lighthouse keeper, David E. Corbin, is buried. There is also at least one Potawatomi burial area on the island, but no one knows where that is exactly. I kept walking the trail until I came to a nice scenic overlook area with a bench where I just sat down and drank some water. I started to hear some talking on the trail ahead of me, but couldn't see anyone yet. There was a bend in the trail, and the trees were thick, so I sat on the bench waiting for these people to come around the bend. The voices were coming closer, and I could tell that they weren't speaking English but couldn't place what language it might have been. Both voices were very deep and guttural. Then, back deep in the woods, I hear a quick and loud "ooh." Immediately, both the voices I was listening to responded with their own "ooh." I kind of smiled because it sounded like these two heard whatever it was in the woods and they were trying to make fun of respond to it. I got off the bench, put on my backpack, and started walking in the direction further down the trail where the voices were coming from, but I never did find these people. The rest of the hike went very well. I visited the cemetery where David E. Corbin was buried. I took a self-guided tour of the lighthouse, and I passed the wooden gate that apparently used to be part of a larger construction. I walked by the great hall and dock area from where I arrived on the island, visited some of the other structures on it, and came across the cemetery where Chester Thorderson was buried. Then finished the loop by returning to my campsite. It was a very nice hike with a lot to see, and it wasn't especially difficult, but I was tired. I did walk down to campsite C to ask the couple I'd spoken to the night before how they fared in the storm, but then realized that they had gone. I was disappointed because I also really wanted to ask them about the squealing noises during the night. The rest of the evening was pretty uneventful. I built a fire, made some meals, had a cigar, and some drinks. As soon as it got dark, I was ready for bed. Since I had so little sleep the night before, I got in my tent and quickly fell asleep. I might have been asleep for about 3 hours when I awoke, suddenly, and was immediately on full alert. Nothing that I was aware of caused me to wake up, but I felt like something was wrong. I sat up in my tent, and this part is a little hard to explain. A feeling of complete dread washed over me. It was unlike anything I'd ever felt before. It felt like there was something in the tent with me. I could feel that it was angry, seething with rage, anger, and I could feel its hatred for me. It felt like something bad was about to happen. I couldn't do anything about it, and I started to shiver uncontrollably. There was a smell of garbage or rotten meat, and it got stronger and stronger to the point where I wanted to throw up, but I couldn't because I was frozen. I had never felt so exposed and helpless. I stared forwards at nothing, just frozen. And the weird thing is, I accepted whatever was about to happen to me. It was like my brain was telling me that whatever was about to happen, even if it's death, would at least be a relief. Then I passed out. At least I assumed I did. All I remember is I woke up at 8 a.m. that morning. When I woke up, I was laying outside of my sleeping bag on top of it, and my legs were in an unnatural and uncomfortable position. I was on my back, with my legs straight out, and my right leg was bent so that my foot was now against my left knee. I packed up everything very quickly and started back towards the dock to catch the first boat off the island. Since the first boat from Washington Island doesn't arrive until 10:30, I had a little time to kill and looked around the great hall and docking area. I wanted to get off the island so badly, but I did feel a little better just being out of the woods so I could see other people. I sat down on a bench a little to the east of the dock and lit a cigar just to give me something to do while trying not to think about the night before. I was sitting just a few minutes and scanning out over the water when I was startled by someone behind me saying, "Hi." I jumped and was embarrassed when the person came around saying, "Sorry, didn't mean to scare you. I just saw you smoking and wanted to ask if you had a lighter." I felt like an idiot and told him it was fine. I just didn't sleep well last night and kind of zoned out. I handed him my lighter and he thanked me. He lit a cigarette, then handed the lighter back. We began talking about the usual things you may speak about. He said he was from the Madison area, and we talked about the storms we've been having. He seemed to be a real outdoorsy kind of guy, and talked about his plans to move to Washington Island. It was a nice, normal conversation and kind of took my mind off the night just for a bit. He seemed pretty nice, and naturally he asked me about what site I had been staying at. I told him I was staying at Site E the last 2 nights, and he says he usually books that site, but I must have reserved it before him. He said he booked Site D the last 2 nights, and I was surprised by this because no tent or anything was at Site D the 2 times I walked past. I told him this, and he says he comes to the island a few times a year, and you have to book a site, but he actually camps at different areas on the island. I asked him where he camps, and he told me that most of the time he camps in the East Cemetery, but he also likes to camp in the woods south of the lighthouse. He told me he hikes about halfway down the Fernwood Trail and just heads north into the woods and finds a place to camp. He shared with me that he once found the ruins of a small log house in those woods, and that he's going to try and find it again and camp inside of it. At this point I started to change my opinion about this guy and wanted to change the subject, but then he asked me if I had heard the screeches in the woods. I took a second to reply, as I knew he was talking about the squealing I'd heard. I told him I had, and asked him if he knew what it was. This time he took a second to reply. I saw his face change. He looked as if he was thinking if he should tell me something like a secret. With no expression at all on his face, he said matter-of-factly, "A demon lives on this island." Under any other circumstance I would have laughed this off, but not after what I experienced the night before. He looked at me, and must have seen the anxiety and fear I was feeling. He surprised me by letting out a quick laugh. He asked me if I saw anything that night, and I told him I hadn't seen anything, and he stared at me like he was trying to figure something out. I felt like he could tell I had experienced something. At this point I was ready for the conversation to be over. He told me he had seen something in the cemetery that night. Now his face and mood kind of changed again, like he was trying to confide in me. I really didn't want to ask the question, but I knew he wanted me to ask it, so I asked him what he saw. My voice was shaky. Then I could tell he changed his mind about telling me. He actually looked at me with empathy and told me what he saw was hard to explain, but if I was afraid of the screeching noises, he didn't think I should go near the cemetery. I didn't say anything right away, but he said 4 words without any context. Keepers of the Flame. I looked at my cigar and ash. I put it out and told him I was going to wait by the docks for the boat. He nodded and I started to walk away. After a few steps he said, "Hey." I turned around to look at him and he said, "Don't come back here." I turned around and started walking again. I don't know if it was a warning or just a friendly suggestion, but I took it to heart. I was definitely not coming back to Rock Island. When I looked up Keepers of the Flame, as it pertained to Rock Island, I found 3 things that he could have been referring to. The name of the Native Americans that lived on the island, the Potawatomi, could be translated to Keepers of the Flame. The lighthouse keepers on the island were sometimes referred to as the Keepers of the Flame. Then there was also a 19th century cult that was said to visit the island from time to time. They called themselves the Keepers of the Flame. I know that hundreds of people visit Rock Island every year and do have a great time camping, hiking the trails and exploring Chester Thordarson's buildings. But my humble suggestion is do not go to Rock Island. I'm from South Jersey and spend a lot of time in the Pine Barrens camping, hiking, off-roading in my Jeep, etc. I started spending more time at Brendan T. Bryan State Forest over the last few years because of the off-road trails. There's a lake called Packim Pond along one of the main roads in the park, and it's a great place to go and park to look up at the stars. Something of note is that this state forest is about 15 miles from Joint Base McGuire/Fort Dix. To get right to it, I've seen strange and unexplainable lights in the trees in different areas of the forest. The first few times were while we were parked at Packham Road and stargazing, that I noticed small lights that would sometimes flicker or stay stationary just below the tree line, easily mistakable for stars. I didn't think too much of it until I realized that during the daytime the tree line was high enough that there's no way I could have been seeing stars through the thick foliage/tree line. I brought my wife with me the next time, specifically to try and show her these strange lights, and sure enough they were there. Not in the same spots, they just seemingly move. 2 years later, I went camping on Thanksgiving Eve with my old friend, and the park was pretty much empty because it was 30 degrees. All night long I could see the lights in the trees below the tree line. They perplex me. I have no clue what they are. I can't find anything about them online, so I think I need to do my own investigation. I don't know what to think. Could they be some sort of lights? Or fairies? I know it sounds ridiculous to say, but it just seems paranormal in nature. Anyone have any explanation? I'd love to hear about it. I was hunting in public land with my dad, several miles from anything close to a trail. So the day goes by and not much is going on. The weather is crap and I'm not hearing distant gunshots, so I reckon the deer aren't moving much. I radio to the old man that I'm going to head back, and we make plans to rendezvous where we had split up that morning. 20 or so minutes later, I was kneeling around the edge of a pond, stripping off all my bulky camo layers. I was just messing around putting stuff in my bag while I listened to my earphones. I can't remember if I had taken my blaze orange hat off or not to remove my pullover, but I had all the appropriate gear to denote myself as a hunter in my possession. As I was digging through my bag, I thought I heard that faint bass of someone yelling. So I took an earbud out and noticed that crouched on the opposite end of the pond, there was a lone forest ranger watching me. I stood up but didn't wave, and wasn't sure if he had even yelled to me in the first place, so I didn't holler anything to him. We just kind of locked eyes for what felt like a few minutes. To be clear, we weren't doing anything illegal. My rifle was unloaded by that point, though slung over my shoulder, obscuring the fact the action was open, and were following all laws and regulations. I hunched back over to my bag, pulled out my walkie and radioed my dad. We've got company. My motives weren't nefarious. I just didn't want my dad to come blumbling down the hill and be surprised by a friendly law enforcement officer. When I looked back up, 15 seconds later the ranger was gone. I mean, he was flat out gone. So eventually I met back up with my dad and started to tell him what happened. He just replied, "Yeah, as deep back here as we are, he probably thought we were up to no good and hit the trail when he saw you hit a radio. They get ambushed like that." As someone who gets nervous and anxious around cops, it never occurred to me that it could be causing them similar anxiety too. If the worker is hearing this now, I'd like to offer you my heartfelt my bad, and to keep up the good work. My friend and I were hiking on some abandoned and unused land. It was really beautiful with lakes, cliffs, and tons of trees. The hike was going really well, but close to dark it turned around. My friend whispered to me that they had been thinking of skinwalkers and couldn't stop. This got me thinking the same, and we decided to head back to the car to eliminate any risk. A few minutes into the hike back, we both got a horrible feeling and it became apparent we weren't alone. We kept making our way back to the car as fast as we could, but it kept getting worse. Both of us experienced blurred vision, and the air suddenly got thick and had a hum to it. It also became incredibly hard to move, and we both experienced an intense urge to lay down and stop hiking. We came across an area we hadn't yet hiked through, but was adjacent to where we were, and there were so many deer prints in every direction, as if a deer had been rapidly pacing there, and human footprints on the other side of the scramble. There weren't any clear starting points of the footprints, and no evidence of other hikers for miles. The trek back to the car seemed to take 5 minutes and 3 hours simultaneously. So no clue how long it took. Neither of us had felt this sense of dread or been this disoriented before. Do you think we had a close encounter with something supernatural, or was it something else entirely? Any information or ideas would be appreciated. I'm a forester of the U.S. Forest Service in Northern California. I've never had anything supernatural happen to me, but it always creeps me out a little when I come across a kill site from a mountain lion. When you're by yourself or in the woods, you're just another link in the food chain, but you don't really think about it until you come across a half-eaten deer and realize a huge cat killed this thing with its face. The strangest thing I've seen would be the time I thought I was about to see a plane crash. As usual, I was working alone on a remote hillside and I saw a plane, like a full-size commercial plane, flying below the ridgeline between mountains. I thought it was going to crash for sure, but it didn't. It just weaved through and kept going. I thought it was weird to not have any logos or writing on it. And then I come to find out we're close to an Air Force base, and they were training pilots for Afghanistan. And this was not a totally uncommon thing to see in the area. My brother is 2 years older, and we've probably spent 10,000 hours and then some in the woods together. Whether it was building forts or BMS tracks to LARPing and hunting, we've traveled across and explored caves, canyons, cliff diving, mountain biking, camping, hunting, whitetail, mule deer, wild boars, etc. since 2016. I feel like adding this is important, because there's genuinely nothing I wouldn't do or fear when I have him by my side, but this time was different, and we both felt it. We've had our fair share of adventures and stories to share, but this one has left a lingering strain in my memory. We were both in our mid-20s and it was 2019. This was probably my 5th time hunting the area, and at first I brought my brother along. It's a large forested area of public land that has a few country roads which are all basically 2 tracks that stretch for miles throughout the area. We make the trip up in my truck with our tents, 3 in total, 1 for each of us and another to change in and keep our gear in. We set up camp a few miles from the truck, which we drove for quite a few miles through the trails, basically the middle of nowhere. Nearest the main road is probably 8 to 10 miles away. We arrived late in the night, set up camp, and quickly fell asleep after a long trip. We then spent the next day scouting and tracking, then made our way back to camp for the night. We cooked, then ate, had some beers and chatted, and the night was still early, but we had a long day and decided to head off for the night. Everything up until this point was normal. I was suddenly awoken to something smacking my tent and hearing my brother's voice call my name. I knew something was off. I called back to him, and he immediately unzipped my tent and made his way inside. I could tell he was disturbed when I went to ask him what was wrong, and he immediately grabbed my shoulder and told me to shush. The sun wasn't up yet, so I think it was around 4:30 to 5 a.m.-ish. We sat in my tent, and what we heard still confuses me to this day. I can only explain it as whale sounds, different tones of extremely loud noise that I could feel through my body. It would come and go, but there would only be a few seconds of silence between the sounds. It would vary from high-pitched squeals and everything in between to very low sounds that had been literally ground-shaking reverb. I regrettably didn't think to grab my phone or record anything that was going on because what I was hearing didn't seem real in the moment. The sound went on until daylight started to break. I believe it was about an hour, but I'm honestly not really sure. Neither of us spoke, and at the time it felt like I could feel the energy around me, almost like my body was covered in white noise. It wasn't even minutes after the sound stopped that it started to rain, and one of the craziest thunderstorms while I was camping happened. The forecast didn't predict any amount of rain for the days we were going to be there prior to making the trip. All the stakes for the tent our gear was in completely ripped out of the ground, and both of our tents had multiple stakes ripped out too. Those things were drove into the ground with an axe, and would take some insane force to just unearth a single one. My brother dismisses it and won't even talk about it, saying it was just machinery being dragged. But at the time, we both shared the same feelings of fear and dread. Just seemed so odd that it was still the middle of the night, and we were so far removed from any nearby community to hear and experience this occurrence. I'm a woodland firefighter in the US. I fought fires all over the Northwest, Eastern Rockies, and Midwest forests, and the only thing that's ever thrown me off was fighting fires in the mountains of Northeast Wyoming, on the Bureau of Land Management's land east of Yellowstone, hiking into a recently burnt valley that was just eerie. Smoke can make that a norm, but the colors were so vibrant even after being touched by fire. Most of the trees and shrubs were unburnt, uncommon but not rare or impossible. Within a few steps of entering the base of the valley, I knew the details like I had lived there all my life, like déjà vu, but with the clarity of reality, and not a momentary second, but 20 minutes and 100 yards of hiking. To be clear, this was a place I'd never been to before, and I was hiking paths that were familiar to me as a brother. Trees I knew, scars opposite me of 20 yards away, stones that were going to be warm, almost hot to the touch, perched inches from an ice-cold stream. Before I turned corners, I knew about a rock shelf that was protecting a small pool with a lush green patch of grass the size of a small room, with small untouched trees. Green grass in Wyoming in August is fairly uncommon, and I stayed there for a moment that felt like an hour. The whole time my hairs were standing up and falling down like I was revisiting a favorite song, and the symphony of emotions like nostalgia, joy, and bliss were just washing over me. Everything felt perfect, every single detail. I finished scouting the valley, went back to my crew, and we moved on. I kept it to myself, not knowing how to explain this perfect place to everyone, let alone myself. This shook me for days. I had no way to rationalize it, and it kept me awake a few nights for the rest of the assignment. Even as we worked, ate, shared fun stories, it still gnawed at me. To this day, 4 years and countless fires fought later, I've never had an experience like it, and likely the only place I've ever desired beyond any to return again, just to touch that perfect part of the world. One of the places I go hiking to a lot is a state park. It's not very popular, and most of the trails are overgrown, but thanks to this ranger there are a ton of trails, and none are so bad that you can't duck and go about your way. I see him all the time, and that in itself is strange. He'll show up 10 feet in front of you on a straight path. He's just there. So I see him all the time hiking and usually coming in and out. We've gotten friendly. I'll usually bring an axe and bow and saw, and he'll just tell me which trails could use some clearing and off I go. So this one day, we do our routine, I sign the book and that, I pack up and head off the trail and see what I can do to clear it up a bit. For me it was a normal regular hike, nothing special at all, except that I made a small campfire, roasted a few hot dogs and had a few beers for lunch. All in all, it was a wonderful, relaxing day. On the way back, the ranger sees me and leads me to his office. I've never been in it, but he's acting nervous as hell, and shows me a registration book, and my name was crossed out, like I had signed out. He asked if I noticed anyone, and I said I hadn't. He just kind of said, "Oh, okay," and that was it, and told me to go on. I never did figure out what happened or why he was so on edge. I would have written it off, but now when I see him, he doesn't talk much, and has always had an excuse to leave. He's still an odd ranger, even by backpacking standards. No matter what loop I do or trails I take, I see him at least twice. He's always going the opposite way each time. I can try and explain some other interactions I've had with the ranger on the trail. I swear to God, he's either the fastest hiker known to humanity, or there's some stuff I can't explain. And no matter where I am in True Park, it's not that huge, I run into this guy coming towards me, always. For my story, I want to take you to a place I called home, in Kentucky County, comprised of old coal mining towns that, at one time, had a bustling economy. Arling. Unfortunately, coal mining died a slow and painful death, and so has my home, which saddens me greatly. Arling is one of the most beautiful places I've ever seen, nestled into the heart of one of the oldest mountain ranges on Earth. The Appalachian Mountains have a tangible natural spirit to them. I, along with my girlfriend and roommate, often hike old trails around the county in hopes of finding interesting sights to see. We are always looking for somewhere neat to hike far out in the sticks. I had a friend of mine ask some of his work buddies if they knew of any rural pathways to test out. One of them mentioned that his father had hiked a path ascending a mountain beside what we call the Old Lake, and that the place scared him to death. The Old Lake is part of a forsaken wildlife management area about 10 miles outside of town towards the state lines, at the base of Mount Mason. The government property only goes so far. Far beyond that is private land owned by a local wealthy family, and presumably abandoned too. The man's father told us how he once hiked along the ascending trail that follows the creek from the lake and up into the mountains past the wildlife management area's boundaries, and I will refer to this place as Lonesome Creek. The man crested a hill and prepared to briefly rest upon a flat spot. He quickly took notice of a shady campsite that had evidently been set up on the flat for some time. It was unremarkable at first glance, nothing there but a fire pit surrounded by wooden chairs, but he could just barely see something else beyond the tree line. It looked as though someone had haphazardly poked big sticks into the surrounding forest. A closer look revealed that what he was looking at were pikes, staked into the dirt and adorned with severed cat heads. The man raised up as if he felt something out there and put it as eyes on him. He quickly put distance between himself and Lonesome Creek and has never again so much as visited the old lake. After hearing this story, it dawned on me that I had been told something similar years ago. This story, too, implied possible ritualistic activity on Mount Mason. As it goes, a mutual friend and his cousin had taken their ATVs on Lonesome Creek at night. Sometime into their ride, the pair spotted a makeshift sitting area right in the middle of the trail. It was shabbily constructed with a few chairs, as well as something like what a preacher holds his Bible on, a pulpit. Even more frightening was a recently doused fire in front of the pulpit. Someone had been there just before they arrived. The two riders killed their engines and unseated themselves, looking around the ridge with their flashlights. As the silence soaked in, they could make out faint voices just beyond some trees on a steep incline near a ridge. Needless to say, they didn't bother shining their lights and left in a hurry. They probed no further. Remembering this incident was enough to have made me look deeper into this harrowing mystery. The occult aspect of Appalachia has always intrigued me. Everything from folk magic to the blackest of practices pervades the history of hill folk and their predominantly Scotch-Irish ancestors who emigrated long ago. In the spirit of curiosity, my girlfriend and I took a midday ride up to the back of the old lake, opposite from where the frequented dockside and the family's boat and fish. The road was in rough shape, and upon arrival it was obvious from the massive amount of trash that the Department of Fish and Wildlife had long abandoned this area too. We walked up the seemingly well-travelled path against the downward stream of the creek. After reaching the marked end of the wildlife management area, we decided it was wise to go no further. The sheer seclusion of the place pulled me in, but I needed to take time to plan carefully and gather up a few things and willing folk before we walk along the old Lonesome Creek. After a quick check of Google Maps, it confirmed the garbage-ridden lakeside to indeed be the bottom of the trail. The path appeared to follow the creek up a massive rocky ridge that wrapped around the side of Mount Mason, leading up to an overview of a newer, larger lake a few miles over. Finding out where to go was simple enough, and I suspected that getting there would not be as such. The following Saturday, I managed to gather and prepare 4 of my friends, with which to set out to the old lake. 2 of us came with firearms, the other 2 brought knives and mace. Confident yet anxious, we left the dirty lakeside and followed up parallel to the creek. The lower part of the trail was lined with large jutting rocks that formed caves below and continued up the mountainside. These enormous jagged pieces seemed to have fallen long ago from the massive ridge above which stood Mount Mason like a crown. Past the caves and closer to the lowest part of the ridge was the trail aligned to the rocky old creek bed, now diverted and empty. We stopped to rest at the bottom of the switchback, now at a high enough elevation to be cradled by a lower portion of the ridge overhanging its trail connecting elbow. After some respite under the stone shade, we began to ascend to the top. The path soon wound away from the creek and continued to repeatedly switch back and forth up the side of a steep, stunningly green hill. Studded into the landscape were small scattered stones laid upon by long fallen trees, all covered in moss, of a believably ancient color. From this point on, the trail was faint but identifiable. Despite the trash at the trailhead, this high-up forest looked absolutely untouched. After mounting the trail, we wound through thick growth made of a tree I'd never seen before. Once atop the hill, we finally checked on Google Maps to see how far we had gone. To our dismay, we were pinpointed way off the trail on the map. We started considering that there was only one visible trail along the whole path, and what was more startling was that we ended up on a trail not listed on Google Maps at all. Admittedly, this wasn't too worrisome since the path was fairly defined, despite not seeing much action. We assessed that we should make the best of the situation anyway, and pressed on a little further to make good use of the remaining daylight. Google Maps showed that we were near a rock-crawling / ATV tourist attraction on the state line called a Hole in the Rock, a wagon tunnel that cut through the mountain's crown near the top. However, the last and only check-in for the area was 5 years ago. Apparently, we had found ourselves on an old wagon trail stretching from our side through the tunnel and into the next on the other side. The place was old for sure. Exciting was the notion of trekking through an archaic commerce road, passing over the old native land of Mount Mason. Interesting stuff. We resolved to find the wagon tunnel and descend before dark, but we did not make it there in time before having to turn around. Nothing exciting happened, but the place has a very different energy to what I'm used to. I'm deadly serious when I tell you that this place has a very different energy than your typical nature trail. It evoked an unsettling combination of serenity and oppression. I found it the perfect place for strangeness in the primordial wilderness. Lonesome Creek seemed as isolated from the rest as Arling is Appalachia to the rest of America. Yesterday, I rang up a lady whom I have known for quite a long time. Marla has been investigating the weird and wild for nearly 20 years and has written numerous books about local Kentucky myths, folklore, and paranormal stories. She has her own sources, and even helped her find and identify an early 20th century cold case victim. Conveniently enough, it also happened that she and her family live about a mile from the old lake, and I knew that if anyone could point me to something, it would be her. To be quite honest, I did not expect the volume nor magnitude of some of the things she told me on the phone call. I have no bias towards the truth of the two stories I've already recounted, but this is different to me. I believe this woman with everything in me, and do not consider myself naive. When Marla married and moved to the Old Lake Road, it seemed nice enough, rural and quiet. She had her first child in '93, who would grow up to be one of my best friends. When he was barely a toddler, his maternal and paternal grandfather took him out into the woods across the road from their house, through their family cemetery, and up a long dirt path. One day, Marla received a call from her father, asking her to tell her father-in-law, who lived on the same property as Marla and her husband, not to take their son up to the mountains that day. He said he'd seen some strange folk camping up there who seemed a little suspicious. Her father must have been pretty concerned, because later that evening the state police showed up at the cemetery. The authorities informed Marla that they had run some people off the mountain, and they appeared to be trying to set up a site to regularly meet and loiter for whatever purpose. Before leaving the cemetery, the policeman she was speaking to told her plainly, "Between me and you, they were doing some strange things up there." When pressed, he would not say, just shook his head and declined to answer. About a year later, Marla got the gall to go with her husband to where the police ran off the loitering creeps. She claims to have found small animal bones scattered around clearly a once-established site, and a concrete slab fitted into the dirt and etched with what she described as obviously evil symbology. This was a time before cell phones, so she had no photo evidence. The next weird experience to befall Marla did not come for nearly 6 more years. It seemed to have spooked her more than anything else she has told me. One evening, Marla thought it would be fun to take her son, then aged 7, on a walk to the old lake to check out the creek, catch salamanders and find rocks, as they often did along the river which runs behind the property. They made their way towards the lake and followed Lonesome Creek towards the initial incline and past the marked wildlife management area. Apart from the creek babble, Marla caught ear of what sounded like loud voices further into the woods. As her son and her continued up to face the second incline, it became evident that a group of people were gathered towards Mason's Crown. A loud voice echoed from above, booming and fervent like that of a typical southern preacher. The voice spoke rapidly and was periodically answered by a group of voices which spoke in unison. Marla and her son listened intently. The chanting began to cease and everything fell quiet. The eerie silence was broken by the booming man's voice angrily shouting in Marla's direction from high atop the ridge, and Marla grabbed her son and ran all the way back down to the trailhead, fearing that whomever had gathered there had seen her and was warding her off. Like the others, she has never been back to Lonesome Creek. Years after her experience with the chanting voices, Marla recounted a time her father and father-in-law had been part of something unexplainable when traveling the trail from the Kentucky side of Mount Mason. Though they had followed a path that both had been walked many times before, the two men became disoriented and got lost. Marla's father said that an anxious feeling washed over him, and suddenly it was as if they simply were somewhere else entirely. They made it home unharmed, in an amount of time they described as unusually short, but were never able to explain the event. It was later realized that they had somehow ended up on the other side of the state line of Mount Mason, way out there. This was not her only account of this phenomenon. Just 2 years after this incident, her father described 2 fish and wildlife officials showed up at her house in the middle of basically nowhere. The men admitted they had no clue where they were and told Marla that they were trying to get to their destination on the neighboring state side but somehow became lost and ended up on the Kentucky side. I find it unsettling that despite having maps and being otherwise familiar with the territory, they ended up miles and miles off track. Marla noted they were visibly shaken by the experience. As time has crept, almost 20 years have passed. Marla has searched for answers to her experiences, but has found few. The only presumption she has gleaned is that there have been inexplicable forces in these mountains since they were settled, and probably long before. Appalachia is closely tied with various oddities and old traditions, both good and bad. Benign covens of witches yet existed with unbroken bloodlines, wannabe satanic groups comprised of lunatics who gain pleasure through the infliction of suffering, old secret societies once prominent but have since died, with coal country's prosperous towns dotted across all of rural Appalachia. There is so much to be uncovered, and there is even more that should be altogether left alone.